Somewhere between the golden glow of Thanksgiving dinner and the silence of modern kitchens, America lost 50 recipes that once defined the holiday itself. These were not side dishes forgotten by accident. They were traditions carried through wars, blackouts, hard winters, and crowded family tables where every plate meant something. Oyster stuffing filled dining rooms before turkey became the center of the feast. Tomato aspics sat proudly beside roast ham in church cookbooks across the country. Creamed onions, giblet gravy, and old-fashioned mincemeat pie were once as common as pumpkin pie is today. But then the recipes disappeared. Not because they tasted bad, because the people who knew them disappeared first. In this video, we are bringing those Thanksgiving dishes back exactly as families remembered them. The flavors, the history, and the stories hidden inside every serving spoon. Watch until the end, because some of these forgotten recipes shaped Thanksgiving in ways most Americans have completely forgotten. And after this video, you may never look at the holiday table the same way again. Part 01: Oyster Stuffing. Long before boxed stuffing covered supermarket shelves, Thanksgiving in many American homes carried the scent of oysters drifting from the kitchen oven. By the late 19th century, oyster stuffing had become one of the most respected holiday dishes in cities along the East Coast. In places like Baltimore, Boston, and New Orleans, families considered it a sign that Thanksgiving dinner was truly special. The recipe sounded unusual even then. Day-old bread was torn by hand and mixed with butter, celery, sage, black pepper, and chopped oysters fresh from nearby waters. The oyster liquor, the salty liquid inside the shell, was never wasted. Cooks poured it directly into the stuffing because that was where the flavor lived. During the 1920s and 1930s, oyster stuffing appeared everywhere from elegant hotel dining rooms to crowded working-class kitchens. A single pan could stretch a holiday meal for large families without sacrificing richness. In coastal communities, oysters were often cheaper than meat, making the dish both practical and luxurious at the same time. But after World War II, tastes began to change. Processed foods arrived quickly. Simpler stuffing recipes replaced regional traditions. By the 1970s, many younger Americans viewed oyster stuffing as strange, old-fashioned, or even intimidating. Yet older generations never forgot it. Many grandparents still remembered the smell of butter and oysters baking together while relatives squeezed around folding tables covered with heavy linen cloths. Some could still hear the crackling radio playing football in the next room while the stuffing browned inside the oven. Today, oyster stuffing survives mostly in faded church cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards stained with butter marks from Thanksgivings long gone. Part 02: Creamed Onions. Before green bean casserole took over the American Thanksgiving table, there was another side dish quietly sitting beside the turkey in thousands of homes across the country: creamed onions. Soft, delicate, and covered in thick white sauce, they appeared so often during the 1940s and 1950s that many families considered them as important as the gravy itself. The dish began with small pearl onions simmered slowly until tender enough to cut with a spoon. Then came the cream sauce. Butter, flour, whole milk, salt, and white pepper were stirred carefully over low heat until the mixture became smooth and heavy. Some cooks added Parmesan cheese. Others sprinkled breadcrumbs across the top before sliding the dish into the oven for a golden finish. In old American households, creamed onions represented patience. Nothing about the recipe was fast. Peeling dozens of tiny onions could take nearly an hour, often becoming a quiet family task before Thanksgiving morning. Children complained about the tears. Grandmothers kept peeling anyway. During the Great Depression and the war years, onions were cheap, reliable, and available even when other vegetables became difficult to afford. The cream sauce transformed an ordinary ingredient into something comforting enough for a holiday table. That mattered to families trying to create celebration during uncertain years. But by the late 1960s, convenience foods changed Thanksgiving forever. Frozen casseroles, canned soups, and instant mixes replaced slow stovetop cooking. Creamed onions began disappearing from younger kitchens one family at a time. Still, many older Americans remember them clearly. The smell of warm milk and butter drifting through the house. The fogged kitchen windows. the serving bowl too hot to touch without a folded towel underneath. Today, creamed onions survive mostly through memory. A dish once passed proudly around crowded Thanksgiving tables now exists mainly in stained recipe books tucked deep inside forgotten kitchen drawers. Part 03. Tomato Aspic. There was a time when no respectable Thanksgiving table in America felt complete without something trembling quietly beside the turkey. Tomato aspic. Bright red, perfectly molded, and chilled until firm, it looked more like decoration than food. Yet throughout the 1940s and 1950s, millions of Americans proudly served it during the holiday season. The recipe combined tomato juice with unflavored gelatin, vinegar, celery, onions, and spices. Some families folded in olives or chopped shrimp. Others poured the mixture into decorative molds shaped like wreaths, crowns, or flowers. Once refrigerated, the aspic emerged glossy and smooth, surrounded by lettuce leaves or spoonfuls of mayonnaise. To modern eyes, it seems strange, even unsettling. But after World War II, gelatin dishes became symbols of progress and sophistication in American kitchens. Refrigerators were becoming common household appliances, and molded foods showed guests that a family embraced modern living. Church cookbooks praised tomato aspic as elegant enough for Thanksgiving dinner and practical enough to prepare a day ahead. In many homes, the dish appeared right beside roast turkey and cranberry sauce. The cold texture balanced the heavy holiday meal, especially in crowded houses warmed by ovens running since sunrise. But by the late 1970s, tastes shifted sharply. Younger Americans moved away from savory gelatin dishes entirely. Tomato aspic became a punchline in magazines and television comedies. Recipes that once represented refinement suddenly looked outdated overnight. Still, older generations remembered the ritual clearly. The careful unmolding onto a glass platter. The nervous moment when the gelatin refused to release cleanly. The pride when it held its shape perfectly under the dining room light. Today, tomato aspic survives mostly through handwritten recipe cards and fading Thanksgiving photographs where a mysterious red shape still sits quietly beside the turkey. A dish once celebrated across America now feels almost impossible to explain to the next generation. Part 04. Giblet Gravy. For generations of American families, Thanksgiving did not truly begin until the giblet gravy reached the table. Thick, savory, and rich with turkey flavor, it poured slowly across mashed potatoes and stuffing while steam fogged the windows of crowded kitchens. Long before packaged gravy mixes filled grocery shelves, this was the taste many Americans associated with the holiday itself. The recipe began deep inside the turkey. Hidden in small paper packets were the giblets, the heart, liver, neck, and gizzard. Nothing was wasted in older American kitchens, especially during the Depression and wartime years. Mothers and grandmothers simmered the pieces slowly with onions, celery, salt, and black pepper for hours, creating a broth powerful enough to flavor the entire Thanksgiving meal. Once the turkey finished roasting, the pan drippings became liquid gold. Flour and butter were whisked carefully into the hot fat before spoonfuls of broth transformed everything into a smooth brown gravy. Finely chopped giblets were stirred back into the mixture, giving the sauce its famous texture and deep flavor. In many households, the gravy mattered more than the turkey itself. A dry turkey could be forgiven if the giblet gravy was good enough. Children often watched nervously as grandparents tasted the sauce directly from wooden spoons, adjusting salt and pepper without measuring anything. The recipe existed entirely from memory. No written instructions. No timers. Just experience passed quietly from one generation to another. But by the 1980s, many younger cooks stopped using giblets completely. Supermarkets began removing organ meats from holiday advertisements, and packaged gravy replaced slow homemade versions. Some families even threw the giblet packet away without opening it. Today, older Americans still remember the smell of simmering turkey necks filling the kitchen before sunrise on Thanksgiving morning. It was not glamorous cooking, but it carried the flavor of survival, tradition, and a holiday meal made carefully by hand. Part 05. Waldorf Salad. At countless American Thanksgiving dinners during the 20th century, one dish brought a strange kind of elegance to the table. Waldorf salad. Cold, crisp, and carefully arranged inside polished glass bowls, it carried the feeling of a holiday that families wanted to make look refined, even during difficult years. The recipe first appeared in the 1890s at the famous Waldorf Astoria, New York, where wealthy guests ate a simple mixture of apples, celery, and mayonnaise. But by the 1940s and 1950s, the salad had spread far beyond luxury hotels. Church gatherings, farmhouse dinners, and suburban Thanksgiving tables all claimed their own version. Some families added walnuts for extra crunch. Others folded in grapes, raisins, or miniature marshmallows. During the post-war years, canned fruit became especially popular, turning the salad sweeter with every decade. Yet the heart of the recipe never changed. Cold apples, crisp celery, and creamy dressing served beside heavy Thanksgiving dishes fresh from the oven. Part of its popularity came from contrast. Thanksgiving meals were warm, rich, and heavy with gravy and butter. Waldorf salad offered something cool and refreshing in the middle of all that richness. For many children, it became the first, grown-up, dish they learned to help prepare. Apples were peeled carefully at the kitchen table while adults warned them not to brown too quickly before dinner. But tastes changed after the 1970s. Many younger Americans began viewing mayonnaise-based fruit salads as old-fashioned leftovers from another era. Fast food culture and modern holiday cooking pushed dishes like Waldorf salad quietly aside. Still, older generations remember the sound clearly. The sharp crunch of celery in a silent dining room while football played faintly from another room nearby. Today, Waldorf salad survives mostly through fading family cookbooks and memories of Thanksgiving tables where elegance once came from the simplest ingredients imaginable. Part 06, Mincemeat Pie. Among all the forgotten Thanksgiving desserts in America, few carry a history as strange and as misunderstood as mincemeat pie. Once considered a centerpiece of holiday tables, it has nearly vanished from modern kitchens, leaving only faint traces in old cookbooks and family memory. In its earliest American form, mincemeat was not simply fruit filling. It was a dense mixture of chopped apples, raisins, cider, sugar, spices, and sometimes preserved beef or suet. In the 19th century, nothing was wasted in American homes. Meat was stretched carefully, especially during winter holidays when supplies were limited and families needed food that could last for days. By the early 1900s, mincemeat pie had become a traditional Thanksgiving dessert in many households. The filling was prepared weeks in advance, stored in cool pantries, and slowly matured as the spices deepened. When baked inside a flaky crust, it produced a dark, rich pie that was served alongside pumpkin and apple. In cities like Philadelphia and rural farming communities across the Midwest, church groups often exchanged handwritten mincemeat recipes as proudly as family heirlooms. Each version was slightly different, depending on available ingredients and personal tradition. But after World War II, tastes began to shift. Refrigeration became standard. Sweet desserts grew lighter and more uniform. Commercial pie fillings replaced slow-prepared mixtures. The idea of fruit combined with preserved meat began to feel unfamiliar to younger generations. By the late 20th century, many Americans had never even tasted mincemeat pie. Some only knew the name from old holiday menus or faded recipe cards tucked inside kitchen drawers. Yet for those who remember it, the flavor is unforgettable. Deep, spiced, and heavy with history, it reflects a time when Thanksgiving desserts were not just sweet endings, but carefully preserved pieces of survival and tradition carried from one winter to the next. Part 07, Watergate Salad. In the 1970s, a new kind of Thanksgiving dish quietly appeared on American tables. It did not come from centuries-old tradition or handwritten farm cookbooks. Instead, it came from convenience, color, and a strange fascination with instant desserts. Watergate Salad. Despite its political-sounding name, the dish had nothing directly to do with the scandal. It was a soft, pale green mixture of pistachio pudding mix, canned pineapple, whipped topping, marshmallows, and chopped nuts. The result was sweet, fluffy, and almost unnatural in appearance. Yet it became surprisingly common at Thanksgiving gatherings across the United States. By the mid-1970s, packaged food companies were changing how Americans cooked. Instant pudding mixes and canned fruits promised desserts that required no baking and very little time. Watergate salad fit perfectly into that new lifestyle. It could be made in minutes, chilled in the refrigerator, and served cold beside traditional holiday dishes. In many homes, it appeared alongside turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce, adding a bright green contrast to the otherwise warm and brown Thanksgiving plate. Children often preferred it over more traditional desserts because of its sweetness and soft texture. But not everyone welcomed it. Older generations, who remembered slower cooking traditions, often saw it as a sign that holiday meals were becoming too dependent on processed foods. Over time, it became associated with potlucks, church dinners, and casual gatherings rather than formal Thanksgiving feasts. Still, during its peak, Watergate salad represented a moment in American food culture when convenience and novelty reshaped even the most traditional holidays. It was less about heritage and more about speed, color, and ease. Today, it survives mostly in retro recipe collections and nostalgic discussions online, remembered as a bright, unusual chapter in the long evolution of the American Thanksgiving table. Part 08: Mysterious Red Devilkin Salad. In many mid-century American kitchens, Thanksgiving preparations sometimes began with a sound that no longer exists in modern cooking. The sharp pull of a can opener, followed by the dull metallic pop of a sealed tin breaking open. Inside one of those cans was a forgotten ingredient that once appeared in countless holiday salads: Red Devil canned food. By the 1940s and 1950s, convenience foods were becoming a symbol of modern American living. Companies experimented with brightly colored, heavily processed ingredients that could survive long storage and still look appealing on a holiday table. One of the strangest outcomes of this era was the use of vividly red can mixtures in molded salads and cold appetizers. Families would combine these contents with gelatin, mayonnaise, chopped vegetables, or even fruit depending on regional taste. The result was often served in decorative molds, chilled until firm, and unmolded carefully onto glass plates. On Thanksgiving tables, it sat between turkey and stuffing like a quiet experiment in modern food science. In working-class homes, these salads represented affordability and creativity. Ingredients were inexpensive, shelf-stable, and easy to prepare ahead of time. During busy holiday mornings, when ovens were already full, these cold dishes provided a practical solution. But as decades passed, taste shifted again. By the late 1970s, processed can mixtures like these began disappearing from mainstream cooking. Fresh ingredients replaced shelf-stable experiments, and food culture moved toward simplicity and natural presentation. Today, very few people recognize these early canned salad ingredients. Most surviving examples appear only in faded advertisements, vintage cookbooks, or old family photographs where unusual red-tinted dishes sit quietly among more familiar Thanksgiving foods. What once represented innovation now feels like a forgotten chapter of American kitchen history, preserved only in memory and curiosity. Part 09: Ambrosia Salad. In the quieter corners of American Thanksgiving tables during the early and mid-20th century, there was always one dish that looked more like a dessert than a side: ambrosia salad. Sweet, creamy, and filled with bright colors, it carried a sense of celebration even before the first bite. The dish became especially popular in the American South, where citrus fruits were more available and often considered a luxury during colder months. Oranges, coconut, and canned pineapple were mixed together with marshmallows and a soft whipped cream base. In some families, cherries were added for color, turning the bowl into something almost ornamental. During the 1930s and 1940s, ambrosia salad often appeared at Thanksgiving gatherings as a special treat reserved for holidays and church suppers. It required no baking and very little cooking, which made it especially valuable during busy holiday preparations when ovens were already occupied with turkey, stuffing, and pies. In homes across states like Georgia and Alabama, ambrosia was more than just a recipe. It was a symbol of abundance during times when fresh fruit was not always easy to obtain. The sweetness of canned pineapple and oranges represented something festive and slightly indulgent. But as the decades passed, ambrosia began to change. Some versions became heavier with whipped toppings and added marshmallows, while others simplified the ingredients. By the 1980s, it was often seen as outdated, replaced by more modern fruit salads and healthier options. Still, many families remember it clearly. The cold, creamy texture served from glass bowls that had been chilled in refrigerators since morning. The bright colors standing out against heavier Thanksgiving dishes. The quiet moment when someone always asked for just a small scoop more. Today, ambrosia salad survives mostly in handwritten church cookbooks and Southern family traditions, where it still appears at holidays as a reminder of simpler, sweeter gatherings from another time. Part 10. Mock apple pie. Of all the forgotten Thanksgiving foods in American history, few are as surprising as the dessert that was never what it claimed to be. Mock apple pie. A pie that looked and tasted like apples, yet contained none at all. It became especially popular during the Great Depression, when families across the United States searched for ways to recreate familiar holiday dishes with limited ingredients. Real apples were not always affordable or available in large quantities. But crackers, sugar, and spices were. The earliest versions of mock apple pie used crushed soda crackers layered with water, sugar, lemon juice, cinnamon, and butter. When baked inside a pie crust, the crackers softened and absorbed the flavor, creating a filling that closely resembled cooked apples in texture and taste. At the table, many guests never realized the difference. By the 1940s and 1950s, the recipe was widely circulated in church cookbooks and newspaper columns. It was often praised as clever, economical, and resourceful. In households where Thanksgiving meant feeding large families on tight budgets, mock apple pie offered a sense of normalcy during difficult years. In rural communities and wartime America, it became a quiet symbol of resilience. A dessert that allowed families to preserve tradition even when ingredients were scarce. But as post-war prosperity grew, real apples became more accessible again. Supermarkets expanded, and traditional fruit pies returned to holiday tables. Mock apple pie slowly disappeared, remembered more as a curiosity than a necessity. Still, older generations recall the moment of surprise when the first slice was cut. The familiar scent of cinnamon rising from the oven, followed by the realization that there were no apples inside at all. Today, mock apple pie remains one of the most remarkable examples of American kitchen ingenuity, where necessity transformed imagination into tradition, even if only for a brief chapter in Thanksgiving history. Part 11. Liverwurst Sandwich Platters. In the middle of 20th century Thanksgiving gatherings, when the oven was already crowded and the turkey still needed hours to finish, there was always a quiet section of the table that required no heat at all. Cold sandwich platters. Among them, one item now almost completely vanished: liverwurst sandwiches. In the 1940s through the 1960s, liverwurst was a common sight in American grocery stores. It was inexpensive, widely available, and easy to slice. Families would spread it thickly on rye or white bread, sometimes adding mustard, pickles, or raw onion for contrast. On Thanksgiving Day, these sandwiches often appeared as early appetizers or late-night leftovers when guests returned for seconds. In many working-class homes, especially in industrial towns and rural communities, these platters were practical. While the turkey roasted slowly for hours, hungry relatives needed something simple to eat. Cold sandwiches filled that gap without interrupting the rhythm of the main meal. In cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh, deli culture helped keep liverwurst present on holiday tables for decades. Small neighborhood butcher shops prepared it fresh, wrapped in wax paper, and handed it across counters with quiet familiarity. But over time, taste changed. By the late 20th century, processed deli meats fell out of favor. Health concerns, shifting preferences, and the rise of modern sandwich fillings pushed liverwurst into the background. Many younger Americans grew up without ever seeing it on a Thanksgiving table. Yet for older generations, the memory remains clear. The smell of rye bread, the sharp bite of mustard, and the soft texture of a sandwich eaten standing in a crowded kitchen while conversations and laughter filled the room. Today, liverwurst platters survive only in rare delis and nostalgic recollections, marking the end of an era when even the simplest sandwich had a place in the Thanksgiving story. Part 12. Jelly Mold Cranberry Ring. In mid-century America, Thanksgiving tables often carried a centerpiece that looked more like decoration than food. A glossy, ruby-red ring of gelatin, carefully molded and chilled until perfectly firm. Inside it, cranberries, sometimes oranges, nuts, or even small fruit pieces suspended like artifacts in glass. It was known simply as the cranberry jelly mold. During the 1950s and 1960s, gelatin-based dishes became a symbol of modern home cooking. Refrigerators had become common in American households, and food companies encouraged creative molded presentations that could be prepared in advance. The cranberry ring fit perfectly into this new style of holiday dining. Families would dissolve flavored gelatin, mix it with cranberry sauce or whole berries, and pour it into bundt pans or decorative molds. Once chilled overnight, it would be turned out onto glass platters, often surrounded by lettuce leaves for contrast. It sat beside turkey, stuffing, and gravy like a bright, polished sculpture. In many homes, especially during the post-war years, it represented order and precision. A dish that could be prepared ahead of time meant less stress on Thanksgiving morning when ovens were already full and kitchens were crowded. But as decades passed, the appeal faded. By the 1980s, molded gelatin dishes were increasingly seen as outdated. Newer generations preferred fresh cranberry sauces or simple compotes made without gelatin. Still, older family members remember the careful ritual clearly. The anxiety of unmolding it without breaking the perfect ring. The glossy surface catching kitchen light just before it was placed on the table. The quiet pride when it held its shape. Today, the cranberry jelly mold survives mostly in vintage cookbooks and faded holiday photographs, where its jewel-like form still sits at the center of Thanksgiving tables that no longer exist. Part 13. Sweet Potato Croquettes. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the 1930s through the 1950s, sweet potatoes were never just baked and served. They were transformed. Mashed, seasoned, shaped, and fried into golden croquettes that carried both sweetness and structure on the holiday table. Sweet potato croquettes often began the day before Thanksgiving. Cooked sweet potatoes were mashed with butter, sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes a hint of nutmeg. The mixture was cooled, then shaped by hand into small cylinders or oval forms. Each piece was dipped in egg, rolled in breadcrumbs, and carefully fried until the outside turned crisp and golden. In homes where every dish had to serve a purpose, croquettes were practical as well as celebratory. They used simple ingredients but created a dish that felt special enough for guests. During the Great Depression and wartime years, nothing was wasted, and sweet potatoes became one of the most reliable staples in American kitchens. In southern states like Mississippi and North Carolina, the dish became especially common at Thanksgiving gatherings. Families often prepared large trays of croquettes ahead of time, frying them just before the meal so they stayed warm and crisp. But as the decades passed, Thanksgiving cooking changed. Baking replaced frying in many households. Casseroles became more common, and simpler sweet potato dishes topped with marshmallows slowly replaced more labor-intensive recipes. Yet those who remember croquettes recall something different. The sound of frying oil in a busy kitchen. The careful shaping of each piece by hand. The small bite that was both sweet and savory at the same time. Today, sweet potato croquettes are rarely seen on modern Thanksgiving tables, surviving mostly in handwritten recipes and the memories of families who once believed that even the simplest ingredient could be turned into something worth celebrating. Part 14. Giblet Bread Dressing. Before boxed stuffing mixes became a holiday shortcut, Thanksgiving dressing in many American homes was built slowly, layer by layer, in large bowls that sat on wooden kitchen tables. One of the most traditional versions, now almost completely forgotten, was giblet bread dressing. The process began early in the morning. Stale bread was torn into uneven pieces and left to dry slightly in the open air. In a separate pot, turkey giblets simmered for hours with onions, celery, salt, and black pepper, creating a rich broth that carried the entire flavor of the dish. Once the bread was ready, the hot broth was poured over it, softening each piece until it absorbed every drop. The chopped giblets were added back in, along with sage, butter, and sometimes a beaten egg to hold everything together. The mixture was then baked slowly until the top formed a golden crust while the inside stayed moist and dense. In rural communities and working-class households across the early 20th century, this dish was a necessity. Nothing from the turkey was wasted. Every part had a purpose, especially during times when food had to stretch across large families and long winters. In states like Kentucky and Tennessee, variations of giblet dressing became deeply rooted in regional Thanksgiving traditions. Each family claimed their own method, passed down quietly without written measurements. But over time, convenience replaced patience. Pre-seasoned stuffing mixes and pre-cooked fillings made the process faster, though something was lost in the transition. Today, giblet bread dressing survives mostly in older handwritten recipe cards, where measurements are faded and instructions rely on memory rather than precision. It represents a time when Thanksgiving cooking was not measured in minutes, but in care, repetition, and the steady rhythm of tradition passed from one generation to the next. Part 15. Corn Pudding Bake. In many American Thanksgiving homes during the early and mid-20th century, corn was not just a side vegetable. It was transformed into something soft, rich, and quietly comforting. Corn pudding bake, a dish once common across rural and suburban tables, carried the warmth of harvest season into the holiday meal. The recipe was simple but patient. Fresh or canned corn was mixed with milk, eggs, butter, sugar, and a small amount of flour or cornmeal. Some families added a pinch of salt or nutmeg to balance the sweetness. The mixture was poured into a baking dish and placed in a slow oven until the top set into a golden crust while the center stayed creamy and soft. During the 1930s and 1940s, corn pudding was especially important in farming communities where corn was a reliable crop even in difficult years. In households across Iowa and Nebraska, it often appeared at Thanksgiving alongside turkey and gravy as a reminder of the harvest that sustained families year after year. Children often remembered it as the quiet dish on the table. Not as bold as stuffing or as sweet as pie, but steady and familiar. It was served in large scoops, often still steaming when brought from the oven to the dining room. But as processed foods became more common in the 1960s and 1970s, corn pudding slowly faded. Instant mixes and frozen sides replaced slower-baked traditions. Many younger cooks never learned the original method, relying instead on packaged alternatives. Still, in older households, the dish remains deeply remembered. The smell of baked corn and butter filling the kitchen. The slow oven heat on a cold Thanksgiving morning. A simple recipe that turned an ordinary crop into something that felt like home itself. Part 16. Oyster Pan Roast. In the coastal kitchens of early 20th century America, Thanksgiving was not complete without dishes that carried the taste of the sea. Among them, oyster pan roast once held a quiet place of honor, especially in cities where fresh shellfish arrived daily from nearby waters. Unlike baked oyster stuffing, this dish was cooked quickly at the stove. Fresh oysters were simmered in their own liquor with butter, cream, and a touch of paprika or Worcestershire sauce. The mixture was gently thickened until it reached a rich, silky consistency, then served immediately while still steaming. In places like San Francisco and Norfolk, oyster pan roast became a respected part of holiday dining culture. Families who lived near ports often treated oysters as an affordable luxury, especially during colder months when harvests were abundant. During the 1920s and 1930s, the dish appeared in both modest homes and upscale restaurants. It was often served in small bowls with crackers or toasted bread, meant to be eaten slowly while the rest of the Thanksgiving meal continued to come together. But over time, its presence began to fade. As refrigeration practices changed and seafood consumption patterns shifted inland, oysters became less common in everyday cooking. Many households moved toward simpler, meat-based holiday dishes that required less preparation and regional sourcing. Yet for those who remember it, oyster pan roast carries a distinct memory. The scent of butter and ocean brine filling a warm kitchen. The quiet sound of simmering sauce on the stove. A dish that felt both delicate and deeply tied to place. Today, it survives mostly in old restaurant menus and coastal family traditions, where Thanksgiving once included flavors drawn directly from the sea's edge. Part 17. Candied carrot logs. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the 1940s and 1950s, vegetables were not always served plain. They were shaped, glazed, and transformed into something that felt festive enough for a holiday table. One of the most unusual examples of this tradition was candied carrot logs. The process began with whole carrots, peeled and boiled until just tender. Instead of slicing them into pieces, home cooks often shaped them into long, smooth forms or arranged them in tight bundles to resemble small logs. These were then coated in a mixture of butter, brown sugar, and sometimes orange juice or honey, before being baked until the glaze turned thick and glossy. In households across Virginia and South Carolina, candied carrot dishes became a familiar part of Thanksgiving spreads. They were especially popular in families who wanted to balance savory dishes with something sweet but still considered a vegetable side. During the post-war era, presentation mattered almost as much as flavor. Cookbooks encouraged creative plating, and shaped vegetable dishes became a symbol of care and effort. A tray of candied carrots placed neatly on the table signaled that a family had prepared something thoughtful for their guests. But by the 1970s, tastes began to change. Simpler roasted vegetables replaced heavily sweetened sides. The idea of turning carrots into dessert-like dishes started to feel outdated to younger generations. Still, older family members remember the shine of the glaze under warm kitchen light, the sticky sweetness that clung slightly to the fingers, the careful effort that went into making ordinary vegetables feel like something special. Today, candied carrot logs survive mostly in vintage cookbooks and fading Thanksgiving memories, where creativity in the kitchen once meant transforming even the simplest ingredients into something unexpectedly celebratory. Part 18. Chestnut stuffing. There was a time when the sound of roasting chestnuts was part of Thanksgiving preparation in many American homes. Before modern convenience foods took over holiday cooking, chestnut stuffing was considered one of the most refined and seasonal dishes on the table. The preparation was slow and deliberate. Fresh chestnuts were scored, roasted until the shells split, then peeled while still warm. Inside, the soft nuts were chopped and mixed with breadcrumbs, butter, onions, celery, sage, and stock. Some families added sausage or poultry liver for depth, while others kept it strictly vegetarian. In the early 1900s, chestnut stuffing was especially popular in northeastern states, where chestnuts were widely available before the blight that devastated American chestnut trees. In cities like New York City and surrounding rural areas, it was a common feature of both home kitchens and hotel dining rooms during the Thanksgiving season. The dish carried a sense of luxury without excess. Chestnuts were rich but not overwhelming, adding a soft sweetness that balanced the savory bread mixture. It was often reserved for special gatherings where families wanted the meal to feel more elaborate than everyday cooking. However, by the mid-20th century, the American chestnut population had nearly disappeared due to disease. Imported chestnuts became expensive and less common in everyday markets. As a result, the dish slowly faded from regular Thanksgiving menus. Modern stuffing mixes replaced the time-consuming process, and younger generations rarely encountered chestnuts outside of seasonal markets or holiday songs. Yet for those who remember it, chestnut stuffing represents a lost flavor of American history. The warmth of roasted shells, the patience of peeling by hand, and the quiet richness it once brought to Thanksgiving tables that no longer exist in the same way today. Part 19. Spiced pear relish. In many early 20th century American Thanksgiving kitchens, fruit was not only served fresh or baked into pies. It was preserved, seasoned, and transformed into condiments that added sharp contrast to heavy holiday meals. One of the most overlooked examples of this tradition is spiced pear relish. This dish began with ripe pears, often slightly overripe, which were peeled and finely chopped by hand. They were then simmered slowly with vinegar, sugar, cloves, cinnamon, and sometimes ginger until the mixture thickened into a glossy, fragrant relish. Some families added raisins or citrus peel for extra depth. In rural communities across Oregon and Washington, pear orchards made the dish especially common during harvest season. Families often preserved large batches in glass jars, saving them specifically for winter holidays like Thanksgiving. The relish was typically served alongside roasted turkey or ham, where its sweet and tangy flavor cut through the richness of the meal. It was also used as a topping for leftover sandwiches the next day, extending the holiday flavors into the days that followed. During the 1920s through 1940s, spiced relishes like this were a staple in American kitchens. They represented a time when preservation was not just practical, but essential. Nothing from the harvest was wasted, and every fruit found a way to last through the colder months. But as refrigeration and commercial sauces became widely available, homemade relishes began to disappear. Bottled cranberry sauces and store-bought condiments replaced long-simmered fruit mixtures. Still, in older households, the memory remains vivid. The smell of simmering pears and spices filling the kitchen. The careful sealing of jars lined up on pantry shelves. A quiet tradition that once connected harvest season directly to the Thanksgiving table, now preserved mostly in forgotten recipe books and family recollections. Part 20. Potato Candy Rolls. In the middle of 20th century America, when Thanksgiving kitchens were filled with long simmering pots and crowded ovens, some of the most surprising holiday dishes came from the simplest ingredients. One of the most unusual was potato candy rolls, a sweet treat that no one expects to find on a modern Thanksgiving table. The recipe began with boiled potatoes, mashed until completely smooth and cooled. To this base, powdered sugar was slowly added until it formed a soft dough. At first glance, it seemed unusual to use a vegetable for candy, but in earlier decades, resourceful home cooks used whatever ingredients were available, especially during difficult economic times. Once the dough was ready, it was rolled flat and spread with peanut butter or sometimes chopped nuts and coconut. Then it was carefully rolled into a log, sliced into small rounds, and served as a sweet finish to the Thanksgiving meal. In rural households across West Virginia and Arkansas, potato candy became a familiar part of holiday traditions. It was especially common during the Depression era, when families learned to stretch simple ingredients into something festive and satisfying. Children often remember it as a hidden surprise on the dessert table. It looked like ordinary candy, but carried a soft, almost melt-in-your-mouth texture that made it unforgettable. Over time, as processed sweets and commercial desserts became widely available, potato candy slowly disappeared from mainstream holiday cooking. Many younger generations never encountered it outside of old family cookbooks or stories from grandparents. Yet for those who remember, it remains a symbol of creativity and necessity. A reminder that even the most basic ingredients could be transformed into something special when Thanksgiving was less about abundance and more about making the most of what was already in the kitchen. Part 21. Ham Glaze Clove Studded Roast. In many American Thanksgiving homes of the early 20th century, turkey was not always the only centerpiece. In countless households, especially across the South and Midwest, a second star quietly shared the table. A slow-roasted ham, deeply scored, glazed, and studded with cloves. The preparation was careful and deliberate. The surface of the ham was cut in a crisscross pattern, creating diamond shapes that would hold flavor during baking. Whole cloves were pressed into each intersection, releasing a sharp, warm aroma as the meat roasted slowly in the oven. A glaze made from brown sugar, mustard, and sometimes pineapple juice was brushed over the surface in layers, caramelizing into a sticky, amber crust. In regions like Kentucky and Georgia, glazed ham often appeared beside turkey on Thanksgiving tables during the 1930s through 1960s. It was considered both practical and generous, allowing families to serve large gatherings with multiple main dishes. The flavor was distinct. Sweetness from the glaze balanced by the saltiness of cured pork, with cloves adding a subtle spice that filled the kitchen long before the meal began. Children often remembered waiting impatiently as the ham baked, the smell drifting through every room in the house. But as Thanksgiving traditions evolved, ham gradually shifted away from the holiday spotlight. Turkey became the dominant symbol of the feast, and simpler side dishes replaced dual centerpiece meals in many homes. Still, older generations remember the sight clearly. A dark, glossy ham resting beside the turkey, carved at the table while guests gathered around. It represented abundance, effort, and a time when Thanksgiving meals were designed not around simplicity, but around generosity that filled every corner of the table. Part 22. Creamed Spinach Gratin. In many mid-century American Thanksgiving kitchens, vegetables were rarely served plain. They were elevated, folded into sauces, and baked until they became something richer than their original form. One of the most overlooked examples of this tradition is creamed spinach gratin. The preparation began with fresh spinach, washed thoroughly and wilted in a hot pan until reduced into soft, dark green leaves. The liquid was drained carefully, and the spinach was chopped finely by hand. A thick cream sauce was then prepared using butter, flour, milk, salt, and white pepper, sometimes enriched with a hint of nutmeg. The spinach was folded into the sauce and transferred into a baking dish. A layer of breadcrumbs and grated cheese was added on top before it was baked until the surface turned golden and slightly crisp. In households across Maryland and Illinois, creamed spinach gratin appeared regularly at Thanksgiving tables during the 1940s and 1950s. It was especially common in homes that valued traditional, structured side dishes that could be prepared ahead of time and baked just before serving. The dish represented balance. Rich enough to feel indulgent, yet still rooted in a simple vegetable that many families grew or bought locally. It was often served in small portions alongside heavier dishes like stuffing, turkey, and gravy. But over time, as cooking habits changed, labor-intensive vegetable dishes like this began to disappear. Frozen sides and quicker recipes replaced slow stovetop preparation. Younger generations grew up with simpler versions of spinach or avoided it altogether. Still, in older cookbooks and handwritten holiday menus, creamed spinach gratin remains a quiet reminder of a different era. A time when even vegetables were treated with care, layered with cream and patience, and baked into something worthy of a Thanksgiving table that took all day to prepare. Part 23: Cornbread Oyster Dressing Casserole. In many coastal and Southern American homes during the early 20th century, Thanksgiving cooking often blended land and sea in ways that feel unusual today. One of the most distinctive examples of this tradition was cornbread oyster dressing casserole. The base began with crumbled cornbread, baked the day before and left to dry slightly so it could absorb flavor. To this, cooks added sautéed onions, celery, butter, and sage. Fresh oysters, chopped or whole depending on preference, were folded into the mixture along with their natural liquor, which gave the dish its signature briny depth. Everything was combined in a large baking dish and cooked slowly until the top became golden and slightly crisp while the inside remained soft and moist. The contrast between the sweet cornbread and the salty oysters defined its character. In states like Louisiana and South Carolina, this dish became a Thanksgiving staple in many families, especially those living near coastal waters where oysters were plentiful and affordable. It reflected a regional identity shaped by both farming and fishing traditions. During the 1930s and 1940s, cornbread oyster dressing appeared in both humble kitchens and holiday gatherings where families prepared large meals for extended relatives. It was not considered strange at the time, but rather a natural extension of local ingredients and seasonal availability. However, as transportation and food distribution changed after World War II, inland Thanksgiving traditions became more standardized. Oyster-based dishes gradually declined in popularity, replaced by simpler bread stuffing recipes that required fewer regional ingredients. Still, in older Southern cookbooks and family memories, this casserole remains vivid. The smell of cornbread baking, the briny scent of oysters, and the slow rhythm of a Thanksgiving kitchen where nothing was rushed, and every ingredient reflected the place it came from. Part 24: Jellied Ham Loaf. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the 1940s and 1950s, resourcefulness shaped the entire holiday table. Nothing was wasted, and even leftover meats found a second life in dishes that today feel almost impossible to imagine. One of the most unusual was jellied ham loaf. This dish began with finely ground ham, often mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and a touch of milk to bind everything together. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and baked until firm. But the defining step came after baking. The loaf was cooled, then coated or surrounded with a savory gelatin made from ham broth, vinegar, and spices, sometimes set in a mold to create a glossy, firm exterior. In industrial towns across Ohio and Michigan, this kind of dish appeared frequently on Thanksgiving tables during the mid-20th century. It reflected a period when home cooking often relied on stretching ingredients across multiple meals, especially in working-class families. The texture was unusual by modern standards. Soft baked meat on the inside, surrounded by a chilled, slightly tangy gelatin layer on the outside. It was sliced like a cold tranche and served alongside other holiday dishes. During the post-war era, gelatin-based savory foods became popular as refrigeration became more common in American households. They allowed families to prepare dishes ahead of time, which was especially useful during busy holiday cooking schedules. But as tastes shifted in later decades, savory gelatin dishes quickly fell out of favor. By the 1980s, jellied meatloaves had nearly disappeared from mainstream cooking, remembered more as a curiosity than a tradition. Still, in older cookbooks and family recollections, jellied ham loaf remains a reminder of a time when Thanksgiving cooking was driven by practicality, creativity, and the determination to make every ingredient count. Part 25. Brown bread and molasses loaf. In many early American Thanksgiving kitchens, bread was not just a side item. It was the foundation of the entire meal. Before modern bakeries and packaged loaves filled grocery shelves, families relied on dense, slow-baked breads that could feed large gatherings. One of the most traditional, now rarely seen, was brown bread with molasses. This loaf was made with a mixture of rye flour, cornmeal, whole wheat flour, and rich molasses. The batter was thick, almost heavy, and often steamed or baked slowly for several hours rather than quickly browned in a hot oven. The result was a dark, moist bread with a deep sweetness and earthy flavor. In New England states like Massachusetts and Maine, brown bread was a Thanksgiving staple during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was often served alongside baked beans, roasted meats, or simply spread with butter while still warm from the oven. The bread carried strong ties to colonial-era cooking traditions, where molasses was a widely used sweetener due to its availability through trade. It became especially associated with cold-weather meals and holiday gatherings. Children often remember its texture more than its taste. Dense, slightly sticky, and filling enough that a single slice felt like a complete meal. It was the kind of bread that required patience, both in preparation and in eating. But as baking became faster and commercial white bread grew more popular, brown bread slowly disappeared from everyday Thanksgiving tables. Lighter rolls and prepackaged loaves replaced long steaming processes. Still, in older households and traditional bakeries, the memory of molasses brown bread remains strong. The smell of deep caramel sweetness filling a kitchen on a cold November morning. A simple, sturdy loaf that once helped define the rhythm of early American Thanksgiving meals. Part 26. Sausage apple stuffed celery boats. In many American Thanksgiving homes of the 1930s through the 1960s, appetizers were not rushed or store-bought. They were carefully arranged small bites meant to welcome guests before the main feast. One of the most unusual yet once common examples was sausage apple stuffed celery boats. The preparation began with fresh celery stalks, washed and trimmed into even lengths. The natural curve of each stalk formed a small boat, ready to hold filling. In a separate bowl, finely ground pork sausage was cooked and cooled, then mixed with chopped apples, cream cheese, black pepper, and sometimes a touch of mustard or mayonnaise. The mixture was spooned into each celery stalk, creating a contrast of crisp vegetable and soft, savory filling with a hint of sweetness from the apple. The result was served chilled on glass platters, often arranged neatly in rows for Thanksgiving guests to enjoy while the main dishes finished cooking. In suburban kitchens across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, these appetizers were especially popular during mid-century holiday gatherings. They reflected a period when presentation and variety mattered as much as flavor, and when hosts often prepared multiple small dishes to show effort and hospitality. But as Thanksgiving food culture shifted toward simpler menus, elaborate cold appetizers began to disappear. Store-bought snack trays and faster preparation methods replaced carefully assembled handmade starters. Still, for those who remember them, sausage apple stuffed celery boats represent a quiet kind of creativity. The crunch of celery, the warmth of sausage, and the unexpected sweetness of apple coming together in a single bite. A small dish that once opened Thanksgiving dinners with charm, care, and a sense of celebration that no longer exists in quite the same way today. Part 27. Cornflake crusted turkey. In the mid-20th century, As American kitchens changed and convenience foods became part of everyday life, even the centerpiece of Thanksgiving began to reflect a new kind of cooking style. One of the most surprising examples of this shift was cornflake-crusted turkey. Instead of relying only on traditional herb rubs or butter basting, some home cooks began crushing cornflakes into fine crumbs and using them as a coating for turkey skin. The bird was brushed with melted butter or milk, then pressed into the cereal crumbs before roasting. As it baked, the coating turned golden, crisp, and slightly sweet. This style of preparation became especially popular during the 1950s and 1960s, when packaged breakfast cereals were heavily promoted as versatile ingredients for home cooking. In many suburban households across California and Texas, holiday recipes often reflected this experimental spirit. For some families, cornflake-crusted turkey was a way to simplify preparation while still achieving a textured, flavorful crust without complicated seasoning blends. Children often found the crunchy exterior more exciting than traditional roast skin, making it a memorable part of the meal. But as culinary trends moved toward more traditional roasting techniques and natural flavors, this method slowly faded. By the late 20th century, it was rarely seen outside of vintage recipe collections or nostalgic cooking demonstrations. Still, it remains a reminder of a unique period in American food history, when innovation often came from packaged pantry items and holiday meals were shaped by both tradition and the influence of modern advertising. Today, cornflake-crusted turkey survives mostly in forgotten cookbooks and old family recipe cards, marking a time when even Thanksgiving could be reimagined through the lens of convenience and creativity. Part 28. Raisin Rum Butter Sauce. In many early 20th century American Thanksgiving kitchens, desserts were never considered complete without a warm, rich sauce poured over the top. Before whipped cream became the standard, one of the most common finishing touches was raisin rum butter sauce, a recipe that once defined holiday sweetness in countless homes. The preparation began on the stovetop. Butter was melted slowly, then combined with brown sugar, water, and a small handful of raisins. The mixture was allowed to simmer until the raisins softened and the sauce thickened into a glossy, golden syrup. In some families, a splash of rum or rum extract was added for depth, especially during formal holiday dinners. This sauce was most often served over bread pudding, steamed puddings, or leftover cakes from earlier in the week. During the 1920s through 1940s, it was especially popular in working-class homes where desserts needed to stretch across large families and multiple days of celebration. In colder regions like Wisconsin and Minnesota, warm sauces like this were valued during Thanksgiving because they added richness and comfort to simple baked desserts that could be prepared ahead of time. Children often remember the smell before anything else. Butter and sugar melting together in a small saucepan while the kitchen filled with anticipation for the meal ahead. The raisins softened into the sauce, creating small bursts of sweetness in every spoonful. But over time, as store-bought toppings and modern desserts became more common, raisin rum butter sauce slowly disappeared from everyday cooking. Fewer families made steamed puddings, and even fewer kept the tradition of warm finishing sauces alive. Today, it survives mostly in old handwritten recipe cards and fading memories of Thanksgiving tables where dessert was not just eaten, but generously soaked in warm, spiced sweetness. Part 29. Corn Oysters Fritters. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, corn was not limited to bread, pudding, or casseroles. It was also transformed into something unexpectedly delicate and crisp. One of the most forgotten holiday dishes from that era is corn oysters fritters. The name came from their shape and texture rather than their ingredients. Fresh corn kernels were cut from the cob, mixed with eggs, a small amount of flour, milk, salt, and pepper, then spooned into hot oil. As they fried, the batter formed small golden patties with crisp edges and a soft, tender center that resembled the texture of cooked oysters, which inspired the unusual name. In rural Thanksgiving kitchens across Indiana and Ohio, corn fritters were a practical and beloved side dish. Corn was abundant during harvest season, making it an essential ingredient for holiday meals that needed to feed large families. During the 1920s through 1940s, these fritters often appeared alongside turkey and stuffing, served hot from the skillet. Cooks worked quickly, frying batch after batch while other dishes finished in the oven. Guests often ate them immediately, sometimes standing in busy kitchens before the main meal even began. But as Thanksgiving cooking shifted toward baked casseroles and oven-based dishes, fried sides like corn fritters became less common. Concerns about time, oil use, and simplicity led many families to replace them with easier alternatives. Still, for those who remember them, corn oysters fritters represent the sound and smell of a different Thanksgiving kitchen. The sizzle of batter hitting hot oil, the golden color forming within seconds, and the simple satisfaction of turning fresh corn into something warm, crisp, and unforgettable. Part 30. Pumpkin Chiffon Pie. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the mid-20th century, pumpkin pie was not always the only dessert on the table. A lighter, more delicate version began to appear in cookbooks and family gatherings: pumpkin chiffon pie. The recipe combined pumpkin puree with sugar spices and beaten egg whites folded carefully into a light, airy filling which was poured into a pre-baked crust and chilled until set. During the 1940s and 1950s, this dessert became popular in home kitchens across the United States, especially in states like Illinois and Pennsylvania, where church cookbooks often introduced lighter variations of traditional holiday pies. Unlike dense custard-style pumpkin pie, chiffon pie offered a softer texture and a more elegant presentation, making it feel modern for its time. But by the 1970s it began to fade as richer and simpler pumpkin pies returned to dominance on Thanksgiving tables. Still, older generations remember the moment when the pie was sliced, revealing its airy structure that held together only through careful preparation and patience. It represented a shift in American dessert culture where tradition met innovation in a single holiday dish that felt both familiar and new. Today, pumpkin chiffon pie survives mostly in vintage cookbooks and faded Thanksgiving menus, where it remains a quiet reminder of changing tastes across generations in American kitchens. Once considered a special holiday alternative rather than a standard dessert choice, it often appeared only in handwritten recipe cards passed between family members during Thanksgiving preparation seasons. Its light texture made it stand out on tables filled with heavier desserts and richer holiday foods. Even though it required more care than many modern recipes, it rewarded patience with a delicate finish that felt ahead of its time and deeply connected to Thanksgiving tradition, reminding families that even desserts once told stories of change. Part 31. Deviled Ham Tea Sandwiches. Long before Thanksgiving appetizers came from plastic grocery trays and frozen boxes, many American families welcomed guests with small handmade sandwiches arranged carefully on decorative platters. Among the most common, now almost forgotten, were deviled ham tea sandwiches. The filling began with finely ground ham mixed with mustard, mayonnaise, black pepper, and sometimes a dash of paprika or pickle relish. The word deviled referred to the sharp seasoning, not extreme heat. The mixture was spread thinly between slices of soft white bread, and the crusts were removed to create neat square or triangle shapes meant for easy serving. During the 1930s through the 1950s, these sandwiches appeared frequently at Thanksgiving gatherings, especially before the main meal. In homes across Virginia and Missouri, relatives arriving early for the holiday often gathered in living rooms, balancing small plates and coffee cups while trays of tea sandwiches circulated quietly through the house. The sandwiches served a practical purpose. Thanksgiving meals took hours to prepare, and guests needed something light to eat while turkey, dressing, and pies continued cooking. Tea sandwiches filled that space without overwhelming the appetite. Presentation mattered deeply during this era. Bread was trimmed evenly, fillings spread carefully, and platters decorated with parsley or olives. Even simple appetizers reflected the effort hosts put into holiday hospitality. But as American food culture shifted toward convenience and casual dining, delicate handmade sandwiches slowly disappeared from Thanksgiving traditions. Store-bought snacks replaced labor-intensive preparations, and younger generations rarely learned the old methods. Still, many older Americans remember the texture clearly. Soft bread, salty ham filling, and the quiet elegance of a holiday gathering where even the smallest appetizer carried care and attention. Today, deviled ham tea sandwiches survive mostly in vintage entertaining guides and fading family memories from Thanksgivings that moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. Part 32. baked squash casserole. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the early and mid-20th century, squash was more than a seasonal vegetable. It was transformed into rich casseroles that carried the warmth of harvest season directly onto the holiday table. One of the most common, now quietly disappearing, was baked squash casserole. The dish usually began with yellow squash or winter squash sliced into thick rounds and simmered until tender. The softened squash was then mixed with butter, eggs, milk, onions, and breadcrumbs or crushed crackers. Some families added cheddar cheese, while others seasoned the casserole simply with salt, black pepper, and sage. Everything was poured into a baking dish and topped with more crumbs before being baked until golden and bubbling around the edges. The result was soft, savory, and deeply comforting, sitting somewhere between stuffing and vegetable side dish. In states like Tennessee and Arkansas, squash casseroles became especially popular during the 1940s and 1950s when home gardens supplied much of a family's produce. Thanksgiving meals often reflected what had been harvested and preserved locally, and squash remained reliable well into late autumn. For many families, the casserole represented practicality. It stretched inexpensive ingredients into a dish large enough to feed crowded holiday gatherings without sacrificing flavor or warmth. But by the late 20th century, simpler roasted vegetables and packaged side dishes began replacing slow-baked casseroles. Younger generations moved away from recipes that required multiple preparation steps and long oven times. Still, older Americans remember the smell clearly. Butter and squash baking together while windows fogged from the heat of a crowded kitchen. The crispy breadcrumb topping cracking softly under a serving spoon. Today, baked squash casserole survives mostly in church cookbooks and family recipe boxes, where it remains a reminder of Thanksgiving meals shaped by gardens, patience, and the quiet comfort of homemade food prepared from what the season provided. Part 33. Pineapple Cheese Casserole. Few forgotten Thanksgiving dishes confuse modern Americans more than pineapple cheese casserole. Sweet, salty, buttery, and baked until bubbling, it sounds like a recipe that should never have existed. Yet for decades, it appeared proudly on holiday tables across the American South. The dish began with canned pineapple chunks or rings layered into a baking dish. Sharp cheddar cheese was sprinkled generously between the fruit, creating an unusual contrast of sweetness and salt. Then came the topping. Crushed buttery crackers mixed with melted butter were spread across the surface before the casserole was baked until golden and crisp. In states like North Carolina and Georgia, pineapple cheese casserole became a familiar Thanksgiving side dish during the 1950s and 1960s. It often sat beside baked ham or roasted turkey, where the sweet pineapple balanced the salty richness of the meat. To many families of that era, the combination did not seem strange at all. Mid-century American cooking embraced bold contrasts and heavily relied on canned ingredients that represented convenience and modern living. Pineapple, once considered exotic and luxurious, gave holiday meals a feeling of celebration even in modest households. Children often loved the casserole immediately, while adults debated whether it belonged closer to the dessert table or beside the stuffing. But over time, changing food trends pushed dishes like this into obscurity. Younger generations moved toward fresher ingredients and simpler flavor combinations. By the late 20th century, pineapple cheese casserole had become more associated with old church potlucks than formal Thanksgiving dinners. Still, those who remember it often recall the smell first. Sweet pineapple mixing with bubbling cheddar and warm buttered crackers fresh from the oven. Today, pineapple cheese casserole survives mostly through Southern family traditions and stained handwritten recipe cards, preserving a time when Thanksgiving tables welcomed unexpected combinations without apology or explanation. Part 34. Turkey Croquettes. For many American families in the decades before disposable abundance, Thanksgiving did not end when the turkey was carved. The leftovers became part of the tradition itself. And among the most beloved second-day dishes were turkey croquettes. The recipe began with chopped leftover turkey mixed with mashed potatoes or thick white sauce to hold everything together. Onions, parsley, black pepper, and sometimes sage were added for flavor. The mixture was shaped into small rolls or patties, dipped into beaten egg, coated in breadcrumbs, and fried until crisp and golden brown. During the 1930s through the 1950s, turkey croquettes appeared regularly in households across Kansas and Missouri, where large Thanksgiving meals were expected to stretch across several days. Families believed wasting food was unacceptable, especially those who had lived through the Great Depression or wartime rationing. Croquettes solved a practical problem. Instead of reheating plain turkey slices repeatedly, leftovers were transformed into an entirely new meal with different texture and flavor. Served with gravy or cranberry sauce, they often felt just as comforting as Thanksgiving dinner itself. Children especially remembered the crispy coating. The sound of croquettes frying in cast iron skillets while the house still smelled faintly of the holiday meal from the day before. But as food culture changed and leftovers became less central to holiday traditions, recipes like turkey croquettes slowly disappeared. Convenience foods and faster lifestyles reduced the need for labor-intensive reused dishes. Still, older generations remember them clearly. The careful shaping by hand. The warm plates carried to kitchen tables crowded with family returning for another day of eating and conversation. Today, turkey croquettes survive mostly in faded community cookbooks and memories of Thanksgivings when every ingredient mattered, and the holiday meal was never truly finished after just one evening. Part 35. Persimmon Pudding. Long before pumpkin pie became the unquestioned king of Thanksgiving desserts, another autumn dish quietly appeared on tables across parts of rural America. Persimmon pudding. Dark, soft, and deeply rich, it carried the flavor of late harvest season into homes where persimmon trees grew wild along roadsides and farm fields. The recipe depended on ripe American persimmons, fruit that had to soften completely before becoming edible. Unripe persimmons were painfully bitter, but once fully ripened, their flesh turned sweet and almost custard-like. Families scooped the pulp by hand and mixed it with flour, eggs, sugar, butter, milk, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Unlike modern puddings, this dessert baked into something dense and moist, closer to a steamed cake than a smooth custard. It was often served warm with cream poured over the top or alongside whipped topping during Thanksgiving gatherings. In states like Indiana and Kentucky, persimmon pudding became a deeply regional tradition during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Families waited for the first frost before harvesting persimmons, believing cold weather improved the fruit's sweetness. For many children, collecting fallen persimmons became part of the Thanksgiving season itself. Buckets were carried into kitchens where grandparents carefully strained seeds and skins from the pulp before baking began. But over time, the dessert slowly faded. Grocery stores rarely sold fresh persimmons in many parts of the country, and younger generations lost familiarity with the fruit entirely. Pumpkin pie and commercial desserts became easier and more predictable choices. Still, older families remember the smell clearly. Sweet spice and dark fruit baking slowly while cold November wind pressed against kitchen windows. Today, persimmon pudding survives mostly in rural traditions and old family recipes, preserving the memory of a Thanksgiving dessert once tied directly to the changing seasons and the harvests growing just beyond the back door. Part 36. Cranberry Relish with Horseradish. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the early and mid-20th century, cranberry sauce was not always sweet and smooth from a can. Some families prepared a far sharper version that startled first-time guests with its intense flavor. Cranberry Relish with Horseradish. The recipe began with fresh cranberries ground by hand or pushed through old metal food grinders clamped to kitchen counters. The berries were mixed with vinegar, sugar, grated horseradish, and sometimes orange peel for balance. Unlike cooked cranberry sauces, this relish was usually served raw or lightly chilled, preserving its sharp texture and bright color. In states like Wisconsin and Minnesota, where preserved meats and hearty holiday meals were common, the spicy relish became a perfect companion to turkey and ham. The heat from the horseradish cut through heavy gravies and rich stuffing in a way sweeter cranberry sauces could not. During the 1930s and 1940s, homemade relishes were considered signs of careful preparation and kitchen skill. Families often prepared them a day ahead so the flavors could strengthen overnight in cold refrigerators or winter pantries. The taste was unforgettable. Tart cranberries first, followed by the sudden heat of horseradish rising sharply through the nose. Adults often loved it immediately. Children usually approached it with caution. But by the late 20th century, commercial cranberry sauces became the standard Thanksgiving choice in most households. The sharper homemade relishes slowly disappeared as convenience replaced labor-intensive preparation. Still, older generations remember the sound of cranberries grinding through hand-cranked machines and the strong scent of fresh horseradish filling the kitchen air. Today, cranberry horseradish relish survives mostly in regional traditions and aging recipe collections, where it remains a reminder that Thanksgiving flavors were once bolder, sharper, and far less predictable than the neatly packaged versions found on modern supermarket shelves. Part 37. Scalloped Oysters. For generations of Americans living near the Atlantic coast, Thanksgiving carried a flavor that has nearly disappeared from modern holiday tables. Scalloped oysters. Rich, buttery, and baked beneath a crisp golden crust, the dish was once considered a seasonal necessity rather than a curiosity. The preparation was deceptively simple. Fresh oysters were layered into a casserole dish with crushed crackers or breadcrumbs, butter, black pepper, and cream or milk. Each layer absorbed the oyster liquor released during baking, creating a savory texture somewhere between stuffing and seafood stew. The top browned slowly in the oven while the inside stayed soft and briny. In coastal communities across Maryland and Virginia, scalloped oysters appeared regularly at Thanksgiving dinners from the late 19th century through the 1950s. Oyster harvesting was once a major industry in these regions, making shellfish affordable even for working-class families during holiday seasons. The dish reflected an older American food tradition where local ingredients shaped Thanksgiving menus more than national expectations. In oyster-producing towns, seafood belonged naturally beside turkey and gravy. For many families, the recipe carried strong emotional memory. The smell of butter and oysters baking together before sunrise. The sound of cracker topping breaking under serving spoons. The quiet pride of presenting a dish tied directly to local waters and generations of family cooking. But over time, changing tastes and declining oyster harvests pushed scalloped oysters into obscurity. Inland-style Thanksgiving menus became more standardized, while seafood dishes slowly vanished from many holiday tables. Today, younger Americans often encounter the recipe only in faded cookbooks or old coastal restaurant menus. Yet for older generations, scalloped oysters still represent a Thanksgiving tradition deeply connected to place, season, and the memory of kitchens where the holiday once tasted partly of the sea. Part 38. Apple Butter Roast Ham. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, holiday cooking was defined by slow preparation and deep, layered flavors. One of the most memorable, now rarely seen, was apple butter roast ham. The dish began with a cured ham, scored deeply across the surface to allow seasoning to penetrate during baking. Instead of a simple glaze, families used thick apple butter, slowly spread over the meat in repeated layers. Brown sugar, cloves, and a touch of mustard were sometimes added to deepen the flavor. As the ham roasted, the apple butter caramelized into a dark, glossy crust that clung to every cut. In states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, apple butter was a seasonal staple, especially in rural communities where apples were preserved in large kettles after harvest. It became a natural addition to Thanksgiving meals, offering both sweetness and acidity to balance heavier dishes. During the 1920s through 1950s, apple butter roast ham often appeared alongside turkey in large family gatherings. It was especially popular in households that hosted extended relatives, where multiple main dishes were expected on the table. Children often remembered the long roasting time. The smell of apples, sugar, and spices filling the kitchen for hours before dinner. The anticipation built slowly as the glaze darkened and thickened in the oven heat. But as Thanksgiving menus simplified in later decades, dual centerpiece meals became less common. Ham gradually shifted to other holidays, while turkey remained the dominant symbol of the season. Still, older generations remember the richness of that combination. The sticky sweetness of apple butter meeting savory cured meat, creating a flavor that defined many mid-century Thanksgiving dinners now preserved mostly in memory and handwritten family cookbooks passed quietly from one generation to the next. Part 39, Green Pea and Pearl Onion Bake. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the mid-20th century, side dishes were often built from simple pantry staples transformed into something festive. One of the most common, now largely forgotten, was green pea and pearl onion bake. The dish began with green peas, often canned or frozen depending on the era, mixed with tender pearl onions that had been boiled until soft. These ingredients were folded into a creamy sauce made from butter, flour, milk, salt, and white pepper. Some families added grated cheese or a sprinkle of breadcrumbs for texture before baking. Once placed in the oven, the mixture developed a light golden crust on top while remaining soft and creamy underneath. It was served hot, usually in a shared casserole dish placed near the turkey and stuffing. In states like New York and New Jersey, this dish was especially common during the 1940s and 1950s when frozen vegetables became widely available. It represented a new era of convenience cooking that still tried to preserve the feeling of traditional home-cooked meals. For many families, it was considered a reliable Thanksgiving side because it could be prepared ahead of time and baked just before serving. It paired well with richer dishes, adding a mild, creamy balance to heavier holiday flavors. But as food culture evolved, simpler vegetable preparations replaced baked casseroles. Roasted or steamed vegetables became more popular, and cream-based side dishes slowly disappeared from many tables. Still, older generations remember the quiet comfort of it. The gentle sweetness of peas, the soft texture of pearl onions, and the creamy warmth that filled the kitchen as it baked. It was not a dramatic dish, but one that reflected the steady, dependable nature of Thanksgiving cooking in an era when every casserole told a story of care, patience, and shared family meals. Part 40, Bourbon Pecan Pie with Molasses. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early and mid-20th century, desserts were not only sweet endings but also reflections of regional identity. One of the richest and most slowly fading traditions from that era is bourbon pecan pie with molasses. The pie began with a simple crust filled with a mixture of eggs, brown sugar, molasses, melted butter, and a small splash of bourbon for depth. Whole pecans were folded into the filling or carefully arranged on top before baking. As it cooked, the sugar mixture thickened into a dark, glossy custard that held the nuts in place like a rich caramel surface. In states like Georgia and Kentucky, this version of pecan pie was especially common during Thanksgiving gatherings in the 1930s through the 1950s. Both regions had strong ties to pecan harvesting and molasses production, making the ingredients naturally available in many households. The bourbon added a subtle warmth rather than strong alcohol flavor, while molasses gave the pie a deep, almost smoky sweetness that distinguished it from lighter modern versions. It was often served warm, sometimes with a small pour of cream on top. For many families, baking the pie was part of the Thanksgiving ritual itself. The slow oven time filled kitchens with the scent of caramelized sugar and toasted nuts, signaling that the meal was nearing completion. But as commercial dessert recipes became more standardized in the late 20th century, simpler pecan pies without molasses or bourbon became the norm. The deeper, more complex versions gradually faded from everyday holiday menus. Still, those who remember it describe the flavor clearly. Rich, dark sweetness balanced with warmth and crunch. A dessert that felt less like a recipe and more like a regional memory baked into every slice of Thanksgiving tradition. Part 41, Sweet Cornbread Custard. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, corn was never limited to savory sides alone. It often crossed into dessert territory in a way that feels unusual today. One of the most quietly forgotten examples is sweet cornbread custard. The dish began with crumbled cornbread, usually baked a day earlier and slightly dried so it could absorb liquid evenly. To this, home cooks added eggs, milk or cream, sugar, butter, and a pinch of salt. Some families included vanilla or nutmeg, depending on regional preference. The mixture was stirred until smooth and poured into a baking dish. As it baked slowly in the oven, the custard set into a soft, spoonable texture while the top formed a light golden crust. The result was neither fully bread nor fully pudding, but something in between that reflected older American home cooking traditions. In farming regions across Alabama and Mississippi, This dish appeared during Thanksgiving gatherings where cornbread was already a staple at nearly every meal. Families often used leftover bread to create something new rather than letting it go to waste. During the 1930s and 1940s, sweet cornbread custard represented both practicality and comfort. It allowed households to stretch simple ingredients into a dessert-like dish that could feed large groups without requiring expensive additions. But as dessert culture changed in later decades, lighter puddings and commercially produced sweets replaced these hybrid recipes. The idea of combining cornbread with custard slowly faded from mainstream holiday cooking. Still, older generations remember it clearly. The warm, soft texture served in deep bowls. The subtle sweetness balanced by cornmeal richness. A quiet Thanksgiving dish that did not demand attention, but gently completed the meal in homes where nothing was wasted and every ingredient had a second purpose. Part 42, Cream Cheese Stuffed Dates. In many mid-century American Thanksgiving gatherings, the appetizer table often carried small, elegant bites that hinted at a more formal dining culture. Among the most understated, now largely forgotten, were cream cheese stuffed dates. The preparation was simple but deliberate. Plump dried dates were carefully split open and pitted, then filled with a smooth mixture of cream cheese, sometimes blended with a touch of vanilla, chopped nuts, or a hint of orange zest. Some families rolled the filled dates in powdered sugar or finely chopped walnuts for added texture. During the 1940s through the 1960s, these small bites were commonly served at holiday gatherings in suburban homes across Florida and California. They reflected a period when American entertaining emphasized polished presentation and a balance between sweet and savory flavors. For many households, they were part of a larger tradition of tea-style appetizers served before Thanksgiving dinner. Guests would arrive early, and platters of small finger foods were passed around while the main meal slowly came together in the kitchen. The contrast of flavors defined the dish. The natural caramel-like sweetness of dates paired with the cool, mild tang of cream cheese created a bite-sized combination that felt both simple and refined. But as American holiday food culture shifted toward larger, more casual spreads, delicate appetizers like stuffed dates began to disappear. Store-bought snack trays and faster preparation methods replaced carefully assembled handmade starters. Still, in older cookbooks and family memory, they remain a symbol of mid-century hospitality. A time when even the smallest Thanksgiving bite was prepared with attention to detail, and when guests were welcomed not only with food, but with quiet gestures of care placed neatly on glass serving trays. Part 44, Sausage Cornbread Dressing. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the early 20th century, stuffing was never a single fixed recipe. It changed from home to home, shaped by regional ingredients and family habits. One of the most flavorful versions, now fading from modern tables, was sausage cornbread dressing. The base began with cornbread baked the day before, broken into coarse crumbs and left to dry slightly. In a separate pan, pork sausage was browned slowly until rich and crumbly, releasing its fat into the skillet. Onions and celery were then sautéed in the same pan, absorbing every bit of flavor. The sausage, vegetables, and cornbread were combined in a large bowl with sage, black pepper, butter, and warm broth. Some families added beaten eggs to bind the mixture before baking it in a deep dish until the top formed a crisp, golden crust while the inside stayed moist and savory. In southern states like Louisiana and Mississippi, this dressing became a Thanksgiving tradition passed through generations. It reflected a cooking style built on resourcefulness, where simple ingredients were layered to create deep, comforting flavor. For many families, it was more than a side dish. It carried the aroma of early holiday mornings, when kitchens were already warm and full before sunrise. The sound of sausage sizzling in cast iron often signaled the beginning of Thanksgiving preparation. But as boxed stuffing mixes and faster recipes became common, labor-intensive versions like this began to disappear. Younger generations often grew up without learning the slow steps required to build its flavor. Still, in older households, sausage cornbread dressing remains a defining memory of Thanksgiving. A dish where time, patience, and simple ingredients came together to create something that felt essential to the holiday itself, even if it now exists mostly in fading handwritten recipes and family tradition. Part 45. Sweet Onion Pie. In many early American Thanksgiving kitchens, especially during the first half of the 20th century, onions were not only used as a seasoning base. They were sometimes the centerpiece of entire dishes. One of the most unusual and now nearly forgotten examples is sweet onion pie. The preparation began with large yellow or sweet onions, sliced thin and slowly cooked in butter until they turned soft, golden, and almost jam-like in texture. This slow caramelization could take nearly an hour, filling the kitchen with a deep, savory sweetness that signaled the holiday meal was approaching. Once softened, the onions were mixed with eggs, cream, a small amount of sugar, salt, and black pepper. The filling was poured into a pie crust and baked until it set into a custard-like consistency with a lightly brown surface. In rural communities across Indiana and Kentucky, sweet onion pie was sometimes served alongside roasted meats during Thanksgiving gatherings. It reflected a time when seasonal produce and pantry staples were creatively transformed into dishes that felt both practical and celebratory. For many families, the pie was a balance between savory and sweet, making it suitable for a table filled with rich gravies, breads, and roasted meats. It was often served warm, sliced carefully like a dessert but eaten as a side dish. However, as modern Thanksgiving menus became more standardized, unusual vegetable-based pies slowly disappeared. Simpler casseroles and familiar sides replaced more experimental recipes that required long preparation times. Still, in older cookbooks and handwritten family notes, sweet onion pie remains a quiet reminder of an earlier era. A time when Thanksgiving cooking embraced bold combinations and when even the humblest ingredient, like an onion, could be transformed into something worthy of the holiday table. Part 46. Chicken and Cornbread Giblet Bake. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, resourceful home cooking often meant combining whatever was available into a single, filling dish. One of the most forgotten examples of this tradition is chicken and cornbread giblet bake. The dish began with cooked chicken, often left over from earlier meals, shredded into small pieces. To this, cooks added crumbled cornbread, sautéed onions, celery, and chopped turkey or chicken giblets that had been simmered slowly in broth. The mixture was bound together with eggs and warm stock, then seasoned with sage, black pepper, and sometimes a touch of thyme. Everything was pressed into a deep baking dish and baked until the top turned golden and crisp while the inside remained moist and dense. The result was a hearty, layered casserole that could feed large families gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. In farming communities across Arkansas and Mississippi, this type of bake was especially common during the 1930s and 1940s. It reflected a period when home kitchens relied heavily on leftover ingredients and seasonal preparation, especially in households where nothing from the holiday meal was allowed to go to waste. For many families, the dish was practical and deeply comforting. It stretched small amounts of meat into a full casserole and used cornbread as both filler and flavor base. But as Thanksgiving cooking evolved and recipes became more streamlined, multi-ingredient baked dishes like this slowly faded from everyday use. Simpler stuffing and side dishes replaced layered casseroles that required longer preparation and more coordination. Still, in older handwritten cookbooks, chicken and cornbread giblet bake remains a reminder of a time when Thanksgiving cooking was less about convenience and more about making every ingredient count, turning leftovers into a second celebration of the holiday table. Part 47. Orange Glazed Cranberry Loaf. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the mid-20th century, cranberries were often shaped into more elaborate dishes than the simple sauces seen today. One of the most visually striking, now largely forgotten, was the orange glazed cranberry loaf. The preparation began with fresh cranberries, simmered gently with sugar until they softened but still held their shape. Orange zest and juice were added to brighten the flavor, along with a small amount of gelatin to help the mixture set into a firm loaf. Once cooled, the cranberry mixture was poured into a loaf pan and refrigerated overnight. When unmolded, it held a glossy, ruby-red form that was often sliced like bread and served cold on glass platters during Thanksgiving dinner. In suburban households across New York and Connecticut, this dish became especially popular during the 1950s and 1960s. It reflected a period when molded foods were seen as modern, elegant, and suitable for holiday entertaining. The combination of tart cranberries and bright citrus gave the loaf a refreshing contrast to heavier Thanksgiving dishes like turkey, stuffing, and gravy. It was often prepared a day in advance, allowing hosts to focus on other parts of the meal. But as tastes shifted and simpler cranberry sauces returned to favor, molded fruit dishes gradually disappeared from most holiday tables. The rise of fresh, less processed sides made gelatin-based presentations feel outdated to younger generations. Still, in older cookbooks and faded family photographs, orange glazed cranberry loaf remains a striking reminder of mid-century Thanksgiving creativity. A dish that blended color, convenience, and presentation in a way that defined an era when even side dishes were designed to impress before they were eaten. Part 48. Buttermilk Herb Drop Biscuits. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, bread was not always baked in perfect loaves. Often, it appeared in softer, more rustic forms that could be prepared quickly while the main meal demanded attention. One of the most common, now slowly disappearing, was buttermilk herb drop biscuits. The recipe was simple and forgiving. Flour, baking soda, salt, and cold butter were mixed together, then combined with tangy buttermilk to form a thick, sticky dough. Fresh herbs such as parsley, sage, or thyme were sometimes folded in, depending on what was available in the kitchen. Instead of rolling and cutting, the dough was dropped by spoonfuls directly onto a baking sheet. This created irregular shapes that baked into soft, golden biscuits with crisp edges and tender centers. In households across North Carolina and Virginia, these biscuits were a Thanksgiving staple during the 1930s through the 1950s. They were especially valued in homes where ovens were already crowded with turkey, casseroles, and pies, since biscuits required only a short baking time. For many families, they were served warm from the oven, often brushed with melted butter and placed in woven baskets lined with cloth. Children would often reach for them first, long before the main dishes were served. But as packaged breads and frozen rolls became more common, traditional drop biscuits began to fade from holiday tables. Convenience replaced the small, hands-on moments of mixing and dropping dough by spoon. Still, in older kitchens and handwritten recipe cards, buttermilk herb drop biscuits remain a quiet symbol of Thanksgiving practicality. A simple bread that required no precision, only timing and care, and that once filled homes with the smell of baking flour and warm butter on cold November mornings. Part 49. Molasses Baked Beans. In many early American Thanksgiving kitchens, especially across colder northern states, baked beans were more than a side dish. They were a centerpiece of endurance cooking, slow-prepared and deeply flavored, carrying the memory of long winters and shared family meals. One of the most traditional versions, now rarely seen on modern tables, was molasses baked beans. The preparation began the night before. Dried navy beans were soaked overnight, then simmered gently until tender. In the morning, they were combined with molasses, brown sugar, salt pork or bacon, mustard, and onion. The mixture was placed in a heavy ceramic pot and baked slowly for hours until the sauce thickened into a dark, glossy coating. In New England states like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, baked beans were a Thanksgiving tradition dating back to colonial times. They reflected a food culture built on preservation, where ingredients had to last through harsh winters and long periods without fresh harvests. For many families, the dish symbolized patience. It could not be rushed. The slow oven transformed simple beans into something rich, smoky, and slightly sweet, filling the entire home with a deep, comforting aroma. But as Thanksgiving menus evolved and cooking time became more limited, long-baked dishes like these began to fade. Canned beans and quicker recipes replaced overnight preparation and slow oven heat. Still, older generations remember the experience clearly. The heavy ceramic pot lifted from the oven, the steam rising as the lid was removed, the deep brown sauce clinging to each bean. Today, molasses-baked beans survive mostly in traditional New England cookbooks and family kitchens that still value slow cooking. They remain a reminder of a Thanksgiving era when time itself was part of the recipe, and patience was as important as any ingredient on the table. Part 50. Spiced Clove Orange Studded Ham Glaze. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, the final touch on holiday meats was not just flavor. It was presentation, aroma, and tradition combined into one finishing layer. One of the most memorable, now rarely prepared, was the spiced clove orange studded ham glaze. The process began with a fully cooked ham, its surface carefully scored into diamond patterns. Whole cloves were pressed into each intersection, releasing a sharp, aromatic scent as the meat baked. The glaze was made from orange juice, brown sugar, mustard, and sometimes a splash of vinegar, slowly reduced until thick and glossy. As it was brushed over the ham in layers, the glaze caramelized in the oven heat, forming a deep amber crust that balanced sweetness with spice. The citrus added brightness, while the cloves created a warm, almost smoky fragrance that filled the entire kitchen long before dinner was served. In states like South Carolina and Alabama, glazed ham often shared the Thanksgiving table with turkey during the 1930s through 1950s. It represented abundance, especially in households hosting large extended families where multiple main dishes were expected. For many families, the preparation itself was part of the holiday ritual. Children remembered watching the slow basting process, the glaze thickening with each pass, and the anticipation of slicing into the dark, glossy crust once the meal began. But as modern Thanksgiving menus became simpler and more standardized, elaborate multi-layer glazes gradually disappeared. Store-bought hams and pre-made sauces replaced long stovetop reductions and repeated basting. Still, in older cookbooks and family traditions, this clove-studded citrus glaze remains a symbol of a different Thanksgiving era. A time when holiday cooking was measured not just in ingredients, but in patience, aroma, and the slow transformation of simple food into something ceremonial and unforgettable. Part 51, Creamed Corn Pudding Casserole. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the early and mid-20th century, corn was treated as more than a vegetable side. It became the base for rich, oven-baked dishes that blended sweetness, creaminess, and comfort into a single casserole. One of the most quietly forgotten versions is creamed corn pudding casserole. The recipe combined whole kernel corn and creamed corn with eggs, milk or cream, melted butter, sugar, and a small amount of flour or cornmeal to help it set. The mixture was stirred until smooth and poured into a baking dish, where it slowly transformed in the oven into a soft, custard-like consistency. As it baked, the edges turned golden while the center remained tender and slightly sweet. The texture was neither fully savory nor fully dessert, but something in between that suited the balance of a Thanksgiving table filled with rich and heavy dishes. In farming regions across Indiana and Illinois, this casserole was especially common during the 1940s and 1950s. It reflected a time when home cooking relied heavily on canned and garden-grown corn, especially during harvest season when families preserved crops for winter meals. For many households, it was a dependable dish that required simple ingredients but delivered a comforting result. It could be prepared ahead of time and baked alongside other holiday foods without much attention. But as Thanksgiving menus modernized and lighter vegetable sides became more popular, creamed corn pudding slowly faded from everyday holiday cooking. Simpler roasted vegetables and packaged sides replaced slow-baked casseroles in many kitchens. Still, older generations remember it clearly. The soft, warm texture served straight from the oven. The faint sweetness blending with butter and corn. A humble dish that once played a quiet but steady role in Thanksgiving meals built on practicality, memory, and the rhythm of seasonal cooking. Part 52, Spiced Apple Cider Gravy. In many early American Thanksgiving kitchens, gravy was not always limited to pan drippings and flour. Some families experimented with seasonal flavors that reflected the harvest itself. One of the most unusual, now nearly forgotten, was spiced apple cider gravy. The preparation began with fresh apple cider simmered slowly on the stove. As it reduced, the natural sugars concentrated, creating a deep amber base. Butter and flour were whisked in to thicken the mixture, followed by black pepper, salt, and warming spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. In some versions, a small amount of turkey drippings was added to connect it back to the main roast, while others kept it entirely cider-based for a lighter, sweeter profile. The final result was a glossy gravy that carried both savory depth and orchard sweetness. In rural regions across Vermont and New York, spiced cider gravies appeared in seasonal cookbooks during the early to mid-20th century. These areas, known for apple orchards, often incorporated cider into multiple holiday dishes, including sauces and desserts. For many families, the gravy represented creativity within tradition. It offered a way to tie the Thanksgiving table directly to the autumn harvest, especially in homes where apple pressing was a community event each fall. But as gravy recipes became more standardized in later decades, fruit-based variations slowly disappeared. Store-bought mixes and traditional pan gravies replaced regional experiments that required longer preparation and seasonal ingredients. Still, those who remember it describe a distinct flavor. Warm spice layered over roasted meat juices, with a subtle sweetness that lingered after each bite. It was a reminder that Thanksgiving cooking once reflected not only tradition, but also the landscape of the season itself, where even gravy could taste like harvested orchards and autumn air. Part 53. Liver and Onion Stuffing. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, nothing from the holiday bird was wasted. Every part had a purpose, and that included ingredients modern tables often avoid entirely. One of the most historically common but now rarely seen dishes was liver and onion stuffing. The preparation began with poultry livers, usually from turkey or chicken, gently sautéed in butter until just cooked through. Onions were added and caramelized slowly until soft and golden, creating a deep, savory base. These were then chopped finely and mixed with day-old bread cubes, sage, black pepper, salt, and warm broth. The mixture was packed either inside the turkey cavity or baked separately in a dish until the top formed a lightly crisp crust while the inside remained moist and rich. In working-class communities across Ohio and Pennsylvania, liver-based stuffings were especially common during the 1930s and 1940s. Families who lived through periods of rationing and economic hardship often relied on organ meats because they were affordable, available, and deeply nutritious. For many households, the dish represented practicality rather than preference. It made use of every part of the animal and stretched simple bread into a filling holiday side that could serve large families gathered around the table. But as food culture shifted in the later 20th century, organ meats became less common in everyday cooking. Milder stuffing recipes without liver replaced the stronger, more robust flavors of earlier generations. Still, in older cookbooks and family memories, liver and onion stuffing remains a reminder of a different Thanksgiving mindset. One shaped by necessity, resourcefulness, and a time when holiday meals reflected not just celebration, but also respect for every ingredient available in the kitchen. Part 54. Maple roasted sweet potatoes with molasses drizzle. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens during the early 20th century, sweet potatoes were prepared in ways that emphasized natural sweetness rather than dessert-like marshmallow toppings seen today. One of the most traditional, now quietly fading variations, was maple roasted sweet potatoes with molasses drizzle. The preparation began with peeled sweet potatoes cut into thick chunks or wedges. These were tossed with melted butter and roasted slowly in the oven until the edges caramelized and the centers became soft. Near the end of cooking, a mixture of maple syrup and a small amount of molasses was drizzled over the potatoes, creating a glossy coating that deepened in flavor as it baked. The combination produced a balance of earthy sweetness and rich, smoky undertones. The maple added warmth, while the molasses gave depth and color, turning a simple root vegetable into a holiday side with strong seasonal character. In rural regions across North Carolina and Georgia, sweet potatoes were a Thanksgiving staple due to their abundance in southern harvests. Families often grew them locally and stored them in cool cellars, making them reliable ingredients for late autumn meals. For many households, this dish represented a more natural approach to holiday cooking, long before heavily processed toppings became common. It was simple, rustic, and closely tied to the agricultural cycle. But over time, sweeter and more indulgent versions replaced traditional roasted preparations. Marshmallow-topped casseroles and candied versions became dominant on Thanksgiving tables. Still, older generations remember the aroma clearly. roasted sweet potatoes mixing with maple and molasses as they caramelized in the oven. A scent that marked the transition from harvest season to holiday gathering, when simple ingredients were transformed slowly and patiently into something deeply comforting and rooted in tradition. Part 55, Walnut Sage Bread Pudding. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, bread pudding was not only a dessert but also a practical way to use every remaining slice of bread after days of preparation. One of the most seasonal and now largely forgotten versions was walnut sage bread pudding. The dish began with stale bread torn into chunks and soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, melted butter, and a small amount of sugar. What made this version unusual was the addition of fresh sage, finely chopped and folded into the mixture, along with toasted walnuts that added a deep, earthy crunch. As it baked slowly in the oven, the pudding set into a soft, custard-like texture with a golden crust forming on top. The aroma combined sweetness from the custard base with the herbal sharpness of sage, creating a flavor profile that blurred the line between savory side dish and dessert. In rural households across Oregon and Washington, walnut sage bread pudding appeared during Thanksgiving gatherings where nuts and herbs were commonly harvested from local farms and gardens. It reflected a time when seasonal ingredients were preserved and reused across multiple dishes. For many families, it was a way to stretch ingredients while still creating something warm and filling for large holiday tables. It often accompanied roasted meats or sat alongside other baked casseroles. But as modern desserts became more standardized and bread pudding shifted toward sweeter profiles, savory herb versions slowly disappeared. Younger generations rarely encountered sage in a dessert context. Still, older cookbooks preserve its memory. The contrast of nutty walnuts and fragrant sage baked into soft custard bread. A dish that once reflected the improvisational nature of Thanksgiving cooking, where flavor, economy, and creativity met in a single warm baking dish passed around a crowded family table. Part 56, Pickled Beet and Apple Salad. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, salads were not always leafy greens or creamy mixtures. They often came from jars, cellars, and careful home preservation. One of the most distinctive, now nearly forgotten, was pickled beet and apple salad. The preparation began with boiled beets, cooled and sliced into thin rounds. These were combined with crisp apple slices, often tart varieties that could hold their texture. The dressing was simple but sharp: vinegar, a small amount of sugar, salt, and sometimes a pinch of cloves or mustard seed. Everything was left to marinate until the flavors blended into a deep, tangy balance of sweet and sour. In colder farming regions across Minnesota and Wisconsin, this salad was a common sight at Thanksgiving tables during the early to mid-20th century. Beets and apples were both widely available in harvest season and stored easily through winter, making them reliable ingredients for holiday meals. For many families, the dish provided a bright contrast to heavier Thanksgiving foods like roasted meats and stuffing. Its sharp flavor helped cut through rich gravies and buttery sides, cleansing the palate between bites. But as refrigeration improved and fresh salads became more common year-round, traditional pickled combinations began to fade. The shift toward milder, fresher flavors left little room for strong, vinegary dishes on holiday tables. Still, in older households, the memory remains vivid. The deep red color staining glass bowls, the crisp bite of apples softened by thyme and vinegar, and the quiet presence of a dish that once brought brightness to winter meals. Today, pickled beet and apple salad survives mostly in vintage cookbooks and rural traditions, where it continues to represent a time when preservation, patience, and seasonal harvests shaped every part of the Thanksgiving table. Part 57, Clove-Studded Orange Cranberry Mold. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the mid-20th century, presentation mattered almost as much as taste. Holiday tables were often decorated with molded salads and jellied dishes that reflected a sense of order and elegance. One of the most striking, now largely forgotten, was the clove-studded orange cranberry mold. The dish began with fresh cranberries simmered with sugar until they softened into a thick sauce. Orange juice and finely grated zest were added for brightness, along with a small amount of gelatin to help the mixture set. Whole cloves were sometimes infused into the mixture during cooking or pressed into the final mold for decoration and aroma. Once poured into a decorative mold, the mixture was chilled until firm. When unmolded, it held a glossy ruby shape, often ringed or fluted, and served cold as a centerpiece alongside the main Thanksgiving meal. In suburban households across Michigan and Illinois, molded cranberry dishes were especially popular during the 1950s and 1960s. They reflected a post-war era when convenience foods and gelatin-based recipes were seen as modern and refined. For many families, the dish added color and structure to the Thanksgiving table. Its bright red tone contrasted with roasted meats and beige casseroles, while its chilled texture offered balance to heavy hot dishes. But as food trends shifted toward fresher, less processed sides, molded salads and gelatin-based presentations began to disappear from holiday menus. Simpler cranberry sauces eventually replaced elaborate molds. Still, in older cookbooks and faded family photographs, the clove-studded cranberry mold remains a vivid reminder of a time when Thanksgiving food was as much about visual presentation as flavor, and when even side dishes were shaped with care, patience, and a sense of celebration. Part 58, Cornmeal Spoon Bread. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, bread did not always arrive in slices or rolls. Some of the most traditional dishes were soft, almost pudding-like creations meant to be eaten with a spoon rather than a hand. One of the most enduring, now rarely seen, was cornmeal spoon bread. The preparation began with cornmeal slowly cooked in milk or water until it thickened into a smooth, porridge-like base. Butter, eggs, and a small amount of baking powder were then folded in, creating a light, airy batter that was poured into a baking dish. As it baked, the top formed a delicate crust while the center remained soft, creamy, and almost custard-like. The texture made it unique among Thanksgiving breads, sitting somewhere between cornbread and soufflé. In rural communities across Virginia and West Virginia, spoon bread was a familiar Thanksgiving side during the early to mid-20th century. It was especially common in households where cornmeal was a staple ingredient, milled locally and used in multiple daily meals. For many families, it represented comfort and simplicity. It required basic ingredients but rewarded patience with a warm, soft dish that paired well with roasted meats and gravies. Children often remember it as one of the softest foods on the table, served in scoops rather than slices, often with butter melting into its warm surface. But as more structured breads and packaged mixes became common, spoon bread slowly disappeared from mainstream holiday cooking. Its delicate texture and short shelf life made it less practical for modern kitchens. Still, in older cookbooks and family traditions, cornmeal spoon bread remains a reminder of a slower, more hands-on era of Thanksgiving cooking. A dish that reflected resourcefulness, regional identity, and the quiet warmth of meals prepared from simple, familiar ingredients. Part 59. Maple Walnut Stuffed Apples. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, desserts often reflected the simplest ingredients of the harvest season. One of the most quietly elegant, now nearly forgotten, was maple walnut stuffed apples. The preparation began with firm baking apples, carefully cored while keeping the bottom intact. The hollow centers were filled with a mixture of chopped walnuts, butter, cinnamon, and maple syrup. Some families added a pinch of nutmeg or a small amount of brown sugar to deepen the sweetness. The apples were then baked slowly until their skin softened and the filling became warm, fragrant, and slightly caramelized. As they cooked, the maple syrup blended with the apple juices, forming a rich sauce that pooled at the bottom of the baking dish. In orchard regions across New Hampshire and Vermont, this dish was especially common during Thanksgiving gatherings in the early 20th century. Apples were abundant in these areas, and families often stored them in cool cellars for use throughout the winter season. For many households, maple walnut stuffed apples represented both practicality and celebration. They used ingredients that were readily available while still creating a warm, aromatic dessert suitable for a holiday table filled with heavier dishes. Children often remember the moment the dish came out of the oven. The soft apples holding their shape just barely, the scent of maple filling the kitchen, and the crunchy contrast of walnuts in every bite. But as pies and more elaborate desserts became standard on Thanksgiving tables, simple baked fruit dishes slowly disappeared. The rise of commercial baking and uniform desserts left little room for these rustic preparations. Still, in older cookbooks and family traditions, maple walnut stuffed apples remain a reminder of a time when desserts were shaped directly by the orchard, the season, and the quiet rhythm of home baking. Part 60. Corn pone with pan drippings. In many American Thanksgiving kitchens of the early 20th century, bread was not always baked in modern ovens or shaped into uniform loaves. In rural homes especially, it was often cooked in simple cast iron pans and flavored with whatever the meal had already produced. One of the most traditional, now largely forgotten, was corn pone with pan drippings. The preparation began with a thick cornmeal batter mixed with water or milk, a small amount of salt, and sometimes a spoon of sugar depending on local preference. Instead of being baked in a loaf pan, the mixture was spread into a well-greased iron skillet, often using leftover drippings from roasted meats. As it baked over steady heat, the edges became crisp and dark while the center remained dense and moist. The drippings infused the bread with savory depth, turning a simple cornmeal mixture into something rich enough to stand beside Thanksgiving meats and gravies. In farming communities across Alabama and Georgia, corn pone remained a Thanksgiving staple well into the mid-20th century. It reflected a cooking style built entirely on practicality, where nothing from the main meal was wasted and every flavor was reused. For many families, it was more than bread. It was a symbol of survival cooking passed down through generations. The sound of batter sizzling in a hot skillet marked the beginning of a meal built from simple, reliable ingredients. But as baking technology improved and softer breads became more common, corn pone slowly disappeared from holiday tables. Its rustic texture and strong corn flavor gave way to lighter rolls and packaged breads. Still, in older cookbooks and rural traditions, corn pone with pan drippings remains a reminder of a Thanksgiving era shaped by cast iron skillets, open kitchens, and the ability to turn even the simplest batter into something deeply satisfying and rooted in everyday life. Mock turtle soup. In the candlelit dining rooms of 19th century America, there was one luxurious soup that made wealthy guests feel important before they even lifted the spoon. It was called mock turtle soup, and despite the elegant name, there was no turtle inside at all. Real green sea turtle soup had become wildly fashionable among the upper class during the 1800s, especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York. But actual turtle meat was expensive, difficult to import, and far beyond the reach of ordinary families. So cooks created something strange, clever, and unforgettable instead. Using a calf's head, organ meat, bones, and rich broth, they slowly simmered the mixture with onions, herbs, cloves, peppercorns, and sometimes a splash of sherry. The gelatin from the calf's head created the same silky texture found in real turtle soup. To Victorian Americans, this imitation became a symbol of ambition. Families who could never afford true luxury could still place mock turtle soup on the dinner table and feel connected to high society for one evening. The smell alone filled old boarding houses and holiday kitchens with deep, earthy warmth. Some recipes even included sliced hard-boiled eggs and tiny meatballs floating in the dark broth. Restaurants proudly served it from silver tureens while newspapers printed endless variations for ambitious homemakers. But as the 20th century marched forward, organ meats slowly disappeared from American cooking. Modern diners lost their taste for calf's head soup, and the old recipe faded into culinary history. Today, many Americans have never even heard the name mock turtle soup before. Yet hidden inside that forgotten bowl was the story of a country trying to imitate luxury during harder times, one spoonful at a time. Banana cream pie with meringue. Long before fast food desserts and supermarket pastries took over America, there was one pie resting proudly inside nearly every small-town diner glass case. Banana cream pie with towering meringue was more than dessert during the 1940s and 1950s. For many families, it was comfort after long workdays, church suppers, and Sunday drives along quiet American highways. The pie began with a flaky homemade crust baked until golden brown. Inside came layers of sliced ripe bananas covered in thick vanilla custard cooked slowly on the stovetop. But the real magic sat on top. Homemakers whipped egg whites into tall clouds of meringue, Then brown the peaks carefully in the oven until the tips turned the color of toasted marshmallows. Every diner waitress knew customers would stop and stare the moment the pie stand rolled past their booth. Bananas once felt exotic in many parts of America. During the early 20th century, they arrived by rail in wooden crates from tropical ports, making banana desserts feel slightly luxurious even for working families. A single slice of banana cream pie could stretch a modest meal into something memorable without costing much money. The smell of warm custard and sweet banana filled countless kitchens while radios played softly nearby. Mothers guarded family pie recipes like treasured secrets, adjusting sugar, vanilla, or crust thickness from generation to generation. Some added nutmeg, while others swore by extra meringue piled impossibly high. But over time, frozen desserts and factory-made pies slowly replaced the handmade version. Diners closed, bakery counters vanished, and real meringue became rare. Today, many younger Americans know banana pie only from plastic packages in grocery stores. Yet the old-fashioned banana cream pie still carries the memory of chrome diners, spinning stools, and a slower America where dessert felt homemade, patient, and deeply personal. Creamed cucumbers. On humid summer evenings across rural America, there was one humble dish quietly sitting beside fried chicken, pork chops, and fresh biscuits. It wasn't fancy, expensive, or meant to impress visitors. It was creamed cucumbers, a cooling farm-style side dish that once appeared on thousands of dinner tables before slowly fading into memory. Fresh cucumbers came straight from backyard gardens, often picked while the morning dew still clung to their skin. Families sliced them paper-thin and dropped them into a warm skillet with butter, cream, salt, black pepper, and fresh dill. The cucumbers softened slightly as they simmered, creating a strange but comforting mixture somewhere between a vegetable side and an old-fashioned gravy dish. During the 1930s and 1940s, recipes like this mattered because they stretched simple garden harvests into filling meals. Rural families couldn't afford waste. If the garden produced too many cucumbers during summer, cooks found endless ways to serve them. Creaming vegetables became especially popular in German-American and Midwestern households, where cream sauces covered everything from peas to cabbage. The smell was gentle and buttery rather than sharp or vinegary like modern cucumber salads. Served warm, the dish carried a softness many people today would find surprising. Children often ate it spooned over boiled potatoes or alongside thick slices of bread to soak up the creamy sauce. As refrigeration, fast food, and packaged side dishes spread across America after the 1950s, old vegetable recipes like creamed cucumbers began disappearing. Younger generations preferred crisp cold salads instead of warm garden dishes simmered on the stove. Slowly, recipe cards were tucked away in kitchen drawers and forgotten. Today, the idea of cooking cucumbers sounds almost unbelievable to many Americans. But hidden inside this vanished dish was the memory of garden abundance, careful thrift, and quiet summer suppers where nearly everything on the table had been grown just steps from the back door. Baked stuffed onions. There was a time when even the plain onion could become the centerpiece of an American dinner table. During the late 19th century and well into the 1940s, baked stuffed onions appeared in cookbooks, boarding houses, and family kitchens across the country. What sounds unusual today was once considered comforting, elegant, and surprisingly filling during hard economic times. Large yellow onions were carefully peeled and hollowed out by hand, leaving thick outer layers intact like little edible bowls. The removed onion centers were chopped and mixed with breadcrumbs, butter, parsley, sage, and sometimes bits of bacon or leftover meat. The mixture was packed back inside before the onions were baked slowly until soft enough to cut with a spoon. As the onions roasted, their sharpness faded into sweetness. The smell drifting through the kitchen felt warm, buttery, and earthy, especially during colder months when fresh vegetables were scarce. Families often served the dish beside roast beef or pork, though per household sometimes ate stuffed onions alone with bread and gravy because meat was too expensive. Recipes like this reflected an older America where cooks were expected to transform ordinary ingredients into something memorable. During the Great Depression, wasting food became almost unthinkable. Every onion, breadcrumb, and herb had value. Housewives proudly turned humble vegetables into dishes that looked far more luxurious than they truly were. In many immigrant households, especially among Irish, English, and German families, stuffed onions carried traditions from Europe into American kitchens. Some versions included cheese, while others added rice or sausage to stretch the filling even further. But after the rise of frozen dinners and processed convenience foods in the 1950s and 1960s, labor-heavy recipes slowly vanished. Few people wanted to spend time hollowing onions anymore. The old recipe cards disappeared into dusty boxes, and stuffed onions became something only grandparents remembered. Yet beneath those golden baked layers lived the story of a generation that knew how to turn almost nothing into supper. Prune cake with buttermilk icing. In many American kitchens during the Great Depression and the years that followed, dessert was not about luxury. It was about survival, thrift, and making something sweet from ingredients nobody else wanted. One forgotten example was prune cake with buttermilk icing, a dark, dense dessert that once appeared at church gatherings, family reunions, and rural supper tables across the country. Prunes were cheap, filling, and easy to store for long periods without spoiling. Homemakers stewed the dried fruit until soft, then mashed it into thick cake batter mixed with cinnamon, nutmeg, flour, and brown sugar. The result was a moist cake with a deep molasses-like richness that filled kitchens with a warm, spiced aroma. Some families added chopped nuts, while others relied only on the sweetness of the fruit itself. But the real signature of the dessert came from the icing. Buttermilk, sugar, butter, and baking soda were cooked together into a bubbling glaze that soaked into the hot cake after baking. The topping formed a sticky layer almost like caramel, giving the humble dessert an unexpectedly rich flavor despite its inexpensive ingredients. During the 1930s and 1940s, recipes like prune cake mattered because sugar and fresh fruit could be difficult to afford. Dried prunes became a clever substitute that stretched limited pantry supplies. Many mothers served the cake with coffee during cold evenings while radios crackled softly nearby with wartime news and country music. Over time, however, prunes developed an unfortunate reputation as food for the elderly, and younger generations stopped baking with them altogether. Supermarket desserts replaced homemade cakes, and old family recipe cards slowly vanished from kitchen drawers. Today, most Americans would never imagine prunes inside a celebration cake. Yet this forgotten dessert carried the flavor of endurance, proving that even during the hardest years, families still searched for small moments of sweetness around the dinner table. Canned Vienna sausage casserole. In countless American kitchens during the 1960s and 1970s, there existed a category of meals known simply as emergency dinners. These were cheap, fast dishes built from canned foods hiding in crowded pantry shelves, ready for nights when money was low, paychecks were delayed, or unexpected guests appeared at the door. One of the strangest was the forgotten canned Vienna sausage casserole. Vienna sausages were tiny canned links packed in salty broth, soft enough to cut with a spoon. They were inexpensive, lasted for months, and became a survival food for working-class families trying to stretch grocery budgets. Homemakers emptied the sausages into baking dishes alongside canned baked beans, ketchup, onions, mustard, and sometimes crushed crackers or breadcrumbs sprinkled across the top for texture. As the casserole baked, the smell became smoky, sweet, and heavily processed in the unmistakable way many mid-century American dinners smelled. Children often loved it because the tiny sausages looked playful, while exhausted parents appreciated how quickly the meal could feed an entire family without much preparation. During post-war America, canned goods symbolized convenience and modern living. Advertisements promised women they could save time in the kitchen while still serving hearty meals. Entire recipe booklets were created around canned meats, condensed soups, and boxed ingredients. Recipes like Vienna sausage casserole spread through church cookbooks, neighborhood potlucks, and handwritten recipe exchanges between busy mothers. But as food culture changed, many of these ultra-processed casseroles became embarrassing reminders of difficult financial times. Fresh ingredients and healthier cooking trends slowly pushed canned sausage dinners out of American homes. Today, Vienna sausages are mostly associated with camping trips, survival kits, or dusty convenience store shelves. Yet hidden beneath that bubbling casserole was the story of ordinary families doing whatever they could to keep dinner on the table. For many children growing up during those decades, the taste of canned sausages and baked beans still carries the memory of crowded kitchens, aluminum pans, and parents trying to make something from almost nothing. Creamed ham and eggs. In mid-century America, before breakfast menus became standardized and restaurant chains took over diners, mornings often began with whatever could be stretched, reused, or quickly assembled from leftovers. One such dish was creamed ham and eggs, a forgotten staple that once filled the plates of working families, boarding houses, and small-town cafes. The recipe was simple but resourceful. Chopped boiled eggs were mixed with diced ham, then folded into a thick white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The mixture was gently heated until it became rich, velvety, and slightly salty. It was usually spooned over buttered toast, biscuits, or even stale bread revived with heat and sauce. This dish reflected an era when nothing was wasted. Leftover Easter ham or Sunday dinner scraps often found a second life in weekday breakfasts. Eggs, affordable and widely available from backyard chickens or local farms, added substance and protein. Together, they created a filling meal that could carry a family through long workdays in factories, farms, or rail yards. During the 1930s through the 1950s, creamed dishes like this were considered practical home cooking. Cookbooks described them as economical and nourishing, words that carried real weight during times of economic uncertainty and recovery. Church groups and women's magazines frequently published variations, each claiming a slightly better balance of flavor or texture. But as American breakfasts shifted toward cereal boxes, bacon strips, and grab-and-go convenience foods, creamed ham and eggs began to disappear. Modern diets moved away from heavy sauces in the morning, and the dish slowly slipped out of restaurant menus and home kitchens alike. Today, it survives only in old handwritten recipe cards tucked inside family cookbooks or fading memories of diners that no longer exist. Yet for those who remember it, creamed ham and eggs represents a time when breakfast was warm, filling, and made entirely from what was already on hand the night before. Graham cracker crust pie, no bake. In the years after World War II, American kitchens began to change quickly. Refrigerators were becoming common, boxed ingredients filled pantry shelves, and home cooks started looking for desserts that didn't require long baking times or complicated techniques. Out of this shift came a quiet classic that once saved countless last-minute gatherings: the no-bake graham cracker crust pie. The foundation was simple: crushed graham crackers mixed with melted butter and a little sugar, pressed firmly into a pie pan. Instead of baking a pastry crust from scratch, homemakers used this quick mixture as a shortcut that still delivered a sweet, buttery base. Inside, the filling could change depending on what was available: vanilla pudding, banana slices, chocolate custard, or even canned fruit folded into whipped cream. This pie became especially popular in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience foods were being celebrated as modern progress. Brands promoted instant desserts and easy entertaining, and this pie fit perfectly into that lifestyle. It could be assembled in minutes, chilled in the refrigerator, and served at church potlucks, holiday dinners, or unexpected family visits. Children loved it for its soft texture and sweet, cookie-like crust. Adults appreciated how little effort it required compared to traditional baked pies. Some families added coconut flakes, others topped it with whipped cream or jelly layers, making every household version slightly different. But as boxed desserts and ready-made pies became more common in grocery stores, the homemade graham cracker pie slowly lost its place. It was no longer seen as special, just simple, old-fashioned, and a little too familiar. Today, it survives mostly in faded recipe cards and nostalgic memories of mid-century kitchens. Yet beneath its humble layers was a quiet story of American households adapting to a new era, where dessert didn't need an oven to feel complete. Cabbage and noodles. In immigrant kitchens and working-class homes across America during the early 20th century, there was a dish that asked for almost nothing, yet delivered comfort on the coldest nights. It was cabbage and noodles, a simple skillet meal that traveled with Eastern European families and quietly settled into Midwestern life. At its core, the dish was built from two inexpensive staples: shredded cabbage and egg noodles. The cabbage was slowly sautéed in butter or rendered fat until it softened, sweetened, and turned golden at the edges. Then boiled noodles were tossed in, along with black pepper, salt, and sometimes a bit of onion or bacon if the household had extra money that week. During the Great Depression and the war years that followed, this meal became a symbol of survival cooking. Cabbage was cheap, grew easily in home gardens, and stored well through winter months. Noodles could be stretched to feed large families, making the combination both practical and filling. In many households, especially among Hungarian, Polish, and German-American communities, this dish carried emotional weight. It was tied to memories of old countries, where similar recipes were cooked in heavy cast iron pans over open stoves. In America, it became both a connection to heritage and a way to survive lean times. The smell of buttered cabbage filling a small kitchen often meant dinner was nearly ready. Children might have complained about the simplicity, but parents knew it was dependable, nourishing, and affordable. A full pan could feed many without waste. As American diets changed in the post-war era, richer sauces, meat-heavy dinners, and processed meals began to replace humble vegetable dishes. Cabbage and noodles faded into the background, remembered mostly in church cookbooks and family recipe boxes. Yet for those who grew up with it, the dish still carries the quiet memory of shared tables, careful budgeting, and the kind of meals that turned almost nothing into something warm and lasting. Mock lobster, codfish. During the hardest years of the Great Depression, American kitchens were filled with invention born out of necessity. When luxury foods disappeared from reach, cooks learned to imitate them using whatever was available. One of the most surprising examples was mock lobster made from codfish, a dish that tried to recreate the taste and texture of seafood once reserved for the wealthy. Codfish was inexpensive, widely available along coastal towns, and easy to preserve through salting and drying. To prepare the dish, the fish was soaked overnight in water or milk to remove excess salt, then gently poached until it became tender and flaky. Some cooks shredded it finely and shaped it into chunks, attempting to mimic the firmness of lobster meat. The final step was serving it with melted butter, lemon, and sometimes a sprinkle of paprika for color. At the time, lobster itself was not always considered a luxury item in earlier American history, but by the early 20th century it had become associated with fine dining and coastal elegance. Mock lobster was a way for inland families to experience that same feeling of indulgence without the cost. Cookbooks from the 1930s often described this dish as practical and clever, reflecting a national mindset focused on stretching resources. In boarding houses and rural kitchens, it was served on Sundays or special occasions when families wanted something that felt a little more festive than ordinary meals. But as transportation improved and real seafood became more accessible, the need for imitation dishes slowly faded. Mock lobster disappeared from menus, replaced by fresh shrimp, crab, and imported delicacies that once seemed impossible to reach. Today, it survives only in old cookbooks and historical food discussions, remembered as a symbol of resilience, when American cooks turned humble codfish into a dish that briefly made poverty feel like something closer to celebration. Creamed parsley root. In the quiet kitchens of early rural America and old immigrant households, there were vegetables that once held a place at the table but slowly vanished as modern grocery stores expanded. One of the most forgotten among them is parsley root, a pale, carrot-shaped vegetable that carried a subtle herbal sweetness and once appeared in humble winter meals across the Northeast and Midwest. Unlike its leafy cousin, parsley root was grown specifically for its underground bulb. Farmers would harvest it in late autumn, store it in cold cellars, and use it throughout the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. To prepare it, cooks peeled and sliced the root, then boiled it until tender before simmering it in butter, cream, salt, and sometimes a pinch of nutmeg or black pepper. The result was creamed parsley root, a soft, slightly sweet side dish with a delicate flavor that sat somewhere between celery and carrot. It was never meant to be bold or attention-grabbing. Instead, it existed as a quiet companion to heavier winter meals like roasted meats, stews, and bread dumplings. In the early 1900s, dishes like this were common in German, Polish, and Scandinavian American homes, where root vegetables formed the backbone of winter survival cooking. Parsley root was reliable, easy to store, and useful when gardens lay frozen under snow. But as refrigeration improved and supermarkets began offering fresh produce year-round, parsley root slowly disappeared from American kitchens. It was replaced by more familiar vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and celery, leaving this once useful root forgotten in seed catalogs and heirloom gardens. Today, few people even recognize it at the grocery store. Yet creamed parsley root remains a reminder of a time when winter cooking depended on patience, storage, and vegetables that could endure months of cold before finally reaching the stove. Jellied egg salad. In mid-century America, when gelatin molds dominated church socials and dinner parties, almost anything could be suspended in a shimmering, wobbly form. It was an era fascinated with convenience, presentation, and the novelty of chilled dishes that could be prepared ahead of time. Among the strangest creations to come out of this trend was jellied egg salad, a dish that now feels almost unthinkable on a modern table. Hard-boiled eggs were chopped and mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, salt, and sometimes celery or pickles for crunch. Instead of being served as a simple salad, the mixture was poured into a mold of lemon-flavored gelatin and left to set in the refrigerator until firm. Once chilled, it was unmolded and sliced like a loaf, revealing pale yellow egg chunks suspended inside translucent jelly. During the 1940s and 1950s, this type of dish was considered modern and even elegant. Cookbooks promoted gelatin-based recipes as clean, efficient, and ideal for busy homemakers. The cold texture was especially appealing in summer months, when kitchens were already warm and stovetop cooking felt exhausting. Jellied dishes also reflected the influence of industrial food innovation. Packaged gelatin products had become widely available, and advertisers encouraged home cooks to experiment with creative molds. Entire recipe pamphlets featured salads, meats, and desserts encased in shimmering blocks of flavored gelatin. But as tastes shifted in the late 20th century, these savory gelatin creations quickly fell out of favor. What once seemed innovative began to feel artificial, even unsettling. Fresh salads replaced molded ones, and simpler presentations returned to the table. Today, jellied egg salad survives mostly as a curiosity in vintage cookbooks and food history archives. It stands as a reminder of a time when American kitchens embraced experimentation so fully that even the humble egg could be transformed into something strangely futuristic, hidden inside a wobbling glass-like mold. Canned mixed vegetable salad. In the middle decades of the 20th century, American kitchens were being reshaped by convenience. Refrigerated trucks, supermarket aisles, and canned goods promised a new kind of modern living, fast, efficient, and available year-round. Out of this shift came a dish that once appeared on countless dinner tables, yet now feels like a forgotten artifact of another food era: canned mixed vegetable salad. The concept was simple. A can of mixed vegetables, usually peas, carrots, corn, and green beans, was opened, drained, and combined with mayonnaise, salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or mustard. In some households, chopped boiled eggs or diced pickles were added for extra texture. The mixture was stirred until thick and creamy, then served cold as a side dish or even shaped into a molded salad for special occasions. During the 1950s and 1960s, this kind of recipe was widely accepted. Canned vegetables represented progress, allowing families to enjoy produce regardless of season or location. Cookbooks and women's magazines often promoted these quick salads as time-saving and nutritious, ideal for busy households adjusting to post-war suburban life. For many families, this dish was also about stretching resources. A single can could feed several people when mixed with mayonnaise or other pantry staples. It became a familiar presence at potlucks, holiday tables, and school gatherings where affordability mattered as much as presentation. However, as fresh produce became more accessible and refrigeration improved, canned vegetable salads began to lose their appeal. The texture was softer, the flavors muted, and the idea of mixing everything into a single cold salad started to feel outdated. Today, it survives mostly in old community cookbooks and faded recipe cards. Yet it remains a quiet reminder of an era when American families trusted canned goods to carry them through busy weeks, transforming simple pantry items into something that briefly passed as a complete meal. Steamed brown bread Kent. In the kitchens of New England during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a humble but deeply traditional bread that carried the memory of colonial cooking straight into modern America. It was known as steamed brown bread, and in one of its most unusual forms, it was even cooked inside old coffee cans, becoming a true symbol of resourceful home baking. The bread was made from a mixture of cornmeal, whole wheat flour, rye flour, molasses, buttermilk, and baking soda. Instead of being baked in an oven like most breads, the batter was poured into greased cans, tightly covered, and then slowly steamed for hours. The result was a dense, moist loaf with a rich, slightly sweet flavor and a deep brown color that reflected its molasses base. This method of cooking dates back to colonial times, when ovens were not always reliable or available in every home. Steaming allowed families to produce bread evenly using simple equipment. By the early 1900s, coffee cans had become a convenient replacement for traditional molds, and the practice continued in rural households for generations. Steamed brown bread was often served alongside baked beans, especially in Boston area households, creating a classic pairing that defined regional comfort food. Cream cheese or butter was spread over warm slices, enhancing its soft texture and earthy sweetness. But as commercial bakeries expanded and store-bought bread became cheap and widely available, steaming bread at home slowly disappeared. The process was too slow, too old-fashioned for modern routines, and coffee cans found new uses instead of bread molds. Today, steamed brown bread survives mostly in specialty restaurants and heritage cookbooks. Yet it remains a quiet reminder of a time when American kitchens relied on patience, improvisation, and simple tools to create food that connected generations through tradition and survival. Creamed kohlrabi. In the quiet corners of immigrant gardens and small Midwestern farms, there once grew a strange, bulbous vegetable that never quite made it into mainstream American cooking. It was called kohlrabi, a pale green or purple root that looked like a cross between a cabbage and a turnip. For a time, it was a reliable staple in German-American kitchens, especially during the early 1900s, before slowly fading into obscurity. Kohlrabi was prized for its resilience. It grew quickly, survived cooler weather, and could be stored for long periods in root cellars. Families harvested it throughout the fall and winter, peeling away its thick outer skin to reveal a crisp, mild interior. When food was scarce or budgets were tight, it became a dependable ingredient that could stretch a meal without much cost. One of the most common preparations was creamed kohlrabi. The peeled and diced vegetable was boiled until tender, then folded into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, milk, salt, and a touch of pepper. Some cooks added nutmeg or parsley for extra flavor, while others mixed in potatoes to bulk it up further. The result was soft, comforting, and subtly sweet, a dish that carried the warmth of home cooking during long winters. It often appeared alongside roasted meats or hearty stews, especially in households that relied heavily on garden produce. But as American diets modernized and grocery stores expanded their produce sections, kohlrabi slowly disappeared from everyday cooking. Its unfamiliar shape and name made it less appealing to new generations, and it was replaced by more familiar vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower. Today, kohlrabi survives mostly in heirloom gardens and specialty markets. Yet creamed kohlrabi remains a quiet reminder of a time when immigrant families turned unfamiliar vegetables into comforting dishes, building a bridge between old-world traditions and the practical realities of American life. Mock omelet, no eggs. During the years of wartime rationing and economic strain, American kitchens were forced into a kind of everyday invention. Eggs, once a simple staple, were sometimes scarce or strictly rationed, pushing home cooks to recreate familiar dishes without the very ingredients they depended on. One of the most surprising results of this period was the mock omelet, a dish that tried to imitate breakfast comfort with almost nothing at all. Instead of eggs, the base was made from flour, water, baking powder, and sometimes milk or powdered substitutes. To mimic flavor and color, cooks added nutritional yeast, turmeric, or a pinch of salt and pepper. The mixture was whisked into a thin batter and poured onto a hot skillet, where it cooked into a soft, folded shape resembling an omelet. Some versions included chopped onions, herbs, or bits of leftover vegetables to give the illusion of a traditional filling. Others were served plain, often with toast or a thin gravy on the side. While it never truly matched the taste or texture of real eggs, it provided something warm, filling, and familiar during uncertain times. This dish reflects the spirit of the 1940s home front, when American families adapted to shortages with creativity rather than complaint. Cookbooks and government pamphlets encouraged substitutions, teaching homemakers how to stretch ingredients and maintain nutrition under rationing rules. But once rationing ended and eggs returned to abundance, the mock omelet quickly disappeared. It was no longer necessary, and few people chose to keep it in their regular cooking rotation. Better alternatives were available again, and convenience foods soon took over breakfast tables. Today, it survives only in wartime recipe archives and historical discussions. Yet it stands as a quiet reminder of resilience, when even breakfast required imagination, and a simple skillet became a place where scarcity was transformed into something that still felt like home. Pickled cantaloupe. In the long history of American preserving traditions, pickling was never limited to cucumbers or green beans. Before refrigeration became common, families experimented with nearly every fruit and vegetable they could store through winter. Among the more unusual results of this preservation culture was pickled cantaloupe, a dish that once appeared in farmhouse pantries and now feels almost completely forgotten. The process began with unripe cantaloupe, still firm and pale green inside. Instead of being eaten fresh, the fruit was peeled, cut into wedges or cubes, and placed into a vinegar brine infused with sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and sometimes ginger. The mixture was boiled briefly, then sealed in glass jars where it would slowly absorb the spiced liquid over time. The result was unexpected. The soft sweetness of melon transformed into something tangy, slightly floral, and warmly spiced. It resembled pickled watermelon rind more than modern fruit dishes, offering a balance between sweet and sour that reflected older preservation tastes. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, recipes like this were common in rural American households where wasting food was unthinkable. Garden harvests often produced more fruit than could be eaten fresh, and pickling ensured nothing went to waste. Women's journals and handwritten recipe books often included entire sections dedicated to fruit pickles, chutneys, and spiced preserves. Pickled cantaloupe was typically served alongside roasted meats or cold holiday spreads, adding a sharp contrast to heavier dishes. It also appeared on Victorian-era tables where elaborate preserved foods were considered a sign of domestic skill and resourcefulness. But as refrigeration spread and fresh fruit became available year-round, the need for preserving underripe melon disappeared. Modern tastes also shifted away from heavily spiced fruit pickles, and the recipes slowly faded from common use. Today, pickled cantaloupe survives mostly in old preservation guides and forgotten family jars, a reminder of a time when even the ripest fruits were sometimes transformed into something entirely unexpected to survive the seasons. Creamed chicken feet. In many working-class kitchens of early 20th century America, nothing from the butcher was truly wasted. Every part of the animal had a purpose, especially during the Great Depression and wartime shortages when families stretched food as far as it could go. Among the most unusual and now almost forgotten preparations was creamed chicken feet. Chicken feet were inexpensive, widely available, and rich in natural collagen. After being cleaned thoroughly and simmered for hours, they softened into a gelatinous texture that many cooks found valuable for broths and sauces. Once tender, the feet were peeled, sometimes deboned, and then folded into a thick cream sauce made from butter, flour, milk, salt, and pepper. The result was a dish that was rich, silky, and deeply nourishing, even if its texture would feel unfamiliar to modern diners. In some households, garlic or onions were added for extra flavor, while others served it over rice, biscuits, or toast to soak up the creamy sauce. This kind of cooking was not unusual in earlier eras. Across immigrant communities, particularly Chinese, Southern European, and Southern American households, chicken feet were considered a practical ingredient rather than something unusual. They provided nutrition, flavor, and body to soups and stews when meat was scarce or expensive. But as American food culture shifted in the mid-20th century, more selective eating habits became common. Cuts like chicken feet gradually disappeared from mainstream grocery stores and restaurant menus. Convenience and aesthetics began to shape what was considered acceptable food. Today, creamed chicken feet is rarely seen outside of traditional or heritage cooking. Yet it remains a reminder of an older culinary mindset, one where resourcefulness mattered more than appearance, and even the most overlooked parts of an animal could be transformed into a filling, comforting meal during difficult times. Butterscotch pie. In the quiet glow of American kitchens during the early to mid-20th century, there were desserts that didn't rely on exotic ingredients or expensive chocolate, yet still carried the warmth of celebration. One of those forgotten comforts was butterscotch pie, a rich, golden dessert that once appeared at Sunday dinners, church suppers, and family reunions across rural towns and small cities. The filling was built from simple pantry staples: brown sugar, butter, milk, flour, and egg yolks. As the mixture cooked slowly on the stove, it thickened into a smooth custard with a deep caramel color and a fragrance that filled the kitchen with sweetness and warmth. Once poured into a baked pie crust, it was often topped with either whipped cream or a soft meringue browned lightly in the oven. Butterscotch pie gained popularity in an era when homemakers were skilled at turning basic ingredients into something special. Brown sugar, more affordable than white sugar in some regions, gave the pie its signature flavor. It became a dessert that felt indulgent without being extravagant, perfect for families watching every penny but still wanting something festive on the table. During the 1930s and 1940s, recipes for butterscotch pie appeared frequently in community cookbooks and women's magazines. Each household had its own variation, some richer, some lighter, some with a hint of vanilla or salt to deepen the flavor. But as commercial desserts and bakery pies became widely available after World War II, homemade custard pies began to fade from everyday life. The patience required to cook and cool a custard slowly no longer fit the pace of modern kitchens. Today, butterscotch pie survives mostly in handwritten recipe cards tucked away in family boxes. Yet it still carries the memory of a time when dessert meant waiting, stirring, and sharing something made entirely from scratch. Canned spaghetti and meatballs casserole. By the 1960s and 1970s, American home cooking was changing faster than ever before. Television dinners were appearing in aluminum trays, supermarkets were expanding frozen food aisles, and busy families were learning to rely on convenience over tradition. In the middle of this shift, one dish quietly became a symbol of quick, no-fuss dining: canned spaghetti and meatballs casserole. At its center was a familiar pantry staple: canned spaghetti and meatballs, often from brands like Chef Boyardee. It was poured directly into a baking dish, sometimes without even heating first. But home cooks rarely stopped there. To upgrade, they added shredded cheese, breadcrumbs, onions, or even leftover ground beef if available. Once baked in the oven, the dish transformed. The sauce thickened slightly, the cheese melted into a golden crust, and the meatballs softened into the pasta. It wasn't gourmet, but it was hot, filling, and fast, everything a working household needed after a long day. This casserole reflected the optimism of mid-century convenience culture. Advertisements promised that canned meals could save time while still feeling homemade. For many families adjusting to suburban life, school schedules, and longer commutes, this kind of cooking was practical rather than nostalgic. Church cookbooks and community recipe cards helped spread variations of the dish, each household adding its own twist depending on budget and taste. Some added bell peppers, others used extra sauce, while some simply baked it exactly as it came from the can. But as food culture evolved and fresh ingredients regained popularity, canned spaghetti casseroles began to feel overly processed and simplistic. Health trends and culinary awareness slowly pushed them out of everyday dinners. Today, it survives mostly in memory and vintage cookbooks, a reminder of a time when dinner could come straight from a can, but still be turned into something warm, shared, and unexpectedly comforting around the family table. Boiled cabbage with vinegar. In the long, difficult seasons of early American rural life, food was often defined by endurance rather than flavor. Families depended on ingredients that could survive cold winters, long storage, and uncertain harvests. Among these simple staples was cabbage, and one of its most forgotten preparations was boiled cabbage with vinegar. The dish began with a whole head of cabbage, cut into thick wedges and dropped into salted boiling water. It simmered until tender, softening into a pale, almost translucent green. Once drained, it was served plain or lightly seasoned, then finished with a sharp splash of malt or apple cider vinegar. The contrast was what mattered. The cabbage, naturally mild and slightly sweet when cooked, met the vinegar's acidity, creating a dish that was both simple and strangely bold. In some households, a bit of butter or bacon fat was added for richness, but many families kept it bare due to cost. During the Great Depression and earlier frontier-era cooking traditions, cabbage was a dependable crop. It grew easily, stored well in root cellars, and could feed large families without strain on the budget. Recipes like this reflected a time when survival cooking was common and seasoning was often minimal. Boiled cabbage with vinegar appeared frequently on working-class tables, especially in Appalachian, German American, and Irish communities. It was not meant to impress, it was meant to sustain. Children often remember it as a strong-smelling dish, while parents saw it as practical nourishment. As American cuisine modernized after World War II, richer vegetable preparations replaced boiled greens. Steaming, roasting, and sautéing became more popular, and vinegar-heavy simplicity fell out of favor. Today, boiled cabbage with vinegar survives mostly in memory and old handwritten recipes. It remains a quiet reminder of an era when food was not about variety or presentation, but about making a single head of cabbage last through another long, uncertain week. Creamed mushrooms on toast. In mid-century America, long before café culture and gourmet brunch menus became common, there was a quiet kind of comfort food that appeared in both home kitchens and small-town diners. It was simple, inexpensive, and deeply satisfying: creamed mushrooms on toast. Fresh or canned button mushrooms were sautéed slowly in butter until they released their earthy aroma. Then came a thick white sauce made from flour, milk, salt, and pepper, poured over the mushrooms until everything turned rich and velvety. The mixture was spooned generously over slices of toasted bread, often slightly stale bread revived by heat and sauce. During the 1930s through the 1950s, dishes like this were considered practical luncheon foods. Women's magazines and cookbooks frequently described them as elegant yet economical, something that could be served quickly to guests without much expense. Mushrooms were inexpensive and widely available, especially canned varieties that made preparation even easier. In boarding houses, hotel cafes, and small diners, creamed mushrooms on toast often appeared as a lunch special or light supper. It was warm, filling, and easy to prepare in bulk, making it ideal for busy kitchens serving working customers. For many families, it became a quiet evening meal as well, something made when time was short but a hot dish was still expected at the table. The creamy sauce soaked into the toast, turning it soft and hearty, while the mushrooms added a deep, savory flavor that felt more substantial than the ingredients suggested. But as fast food expanded and breakfast and lunch menus became more standardized, dishes like this gradually faded from everyday cooking. Modern tastes shifted toward lighter toppings and quicker meals. Today, creamed mushrooms on toast survives mostly in retro recipe collections and nostalgic diners. It remains a reminder of an era when a simple pan, a few pantry staples, and a slice of bread could be turned into a warm, complete meal that quietly carried families through the day. Lemon sponge pudding. In the early decades of American home baking, before boxed desserts dominated kitchen shelves, families often relied on simple, magic recipes that transformed basic pantry ingredients into something far more delicate and surprising. One of the most elegant examples was lemon sponge pudding, a dessert that seemed to defy logic as it baked. At first glance, the mixture looked unremarkable: eggs, sugar, flour, milk, lemon juice, and zest whisked together into a thin batter. But something remarkable happened in the oven. As it baked in a water bath, the batter separated into two distinct layers, soft sponge cake floating on top, and a silky lemon custard forming underneath. During the 1930s and 1940s, recipes like this were treasured in American households because they required very little but delivered a sense of refinement. Lemons, though not grown locally in most regions, were widely available and gave the dessert a bright, refreshing flavor that stood out against heavier winter meals. Lemon sponge pudding often appeared at church suppers, holiday gatherings, and family Sunday dinners. It was served warm, usually in small bowls, allowing diners to experience both layers in each spoonful, the airy cake first, followed by the tart, creamy sauce beneath. Cookbooks of the era sometimes called it a self-saucing pudding, a term that fascinated home bakers and made the recipe feel almost magical. It was especially popular during times when elaborate desserts were too expensive or time-consuming to prepare. But as refrigeration improved and store-bought desserts became more common, delicate baked puddings like this began to fade. They required patience, careful timing, and a willingness to trust the oven. Today, lemon sponge pudding survives mostly in old handwritten recipe cards and vintage cookbooks. Yet it remains a quiet reminder of a time when simple ingredients could transform in the heat of an oven into something unexpectedly layered, comforting, and almost impossible to believe. Canned tuna and pea casserole. In post-war American kitchens, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, dinner often meant making something filling out of whatever was already in the pantry. Convenience foods were celebrated as progress, and frozen or canned ingredients became the backbone of many weeknight meals. Among them was a humble and now largely forgotten staple, canned tuna and pea casserole. The dish began with canned tuna, drained and flaked into a baking dish. To that, cooks added canned peas, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and sometimes a splash of milk to loosen the mixture. Everything was stirred together until it formed a thick, pale base. For texture, crushed potato chips, breadcrumbs, or even buttered crackers were scattered across the top before baking. As it baked in the oven, the casserole developed a warm, savory smell that filled small suburban kitchens. The topping turned golden and crisp, while the inside remained soft and creamy. It was inexpensive, required almost no preparation, and could feed an entire family in one dish. This casserole reflected a new era of American food culture. Canned tuna had become widely popular due to its affordability and long shelf life, especially after wartime rationing encouraged protein substitutes. Paired with condensed soups, it created an entire category of quick casseroles that appeared in women's magazines, church cookbooks, and promotional recipe booklets. For many families, it was a dependable solution on busy nights when time and money were limited. Children often recognized it instantly, sometimes with mixed reactions, but it remained a practical favorite in many homes. However, as fresh ingredients and changing tastes took hold in later decades, tuna casseroles began to lose their appeal. Heavily processed soups and canned vegetables felt outdated compared to lighter, fresher meals. Today, canned tuna and pea casserole survives mostly in vintage recipe archives, remembered as a dish that once represented convenience, thrift, and the everyday reality of feeding a family with whatever the pantry could provide. Pickled okra. In the warm kitchens of the American South, where preservation was as important as flavor, pickling was more than a cooking method, it was a way of life. Among the many vegetables stored in jars for long winters and long workdays, pickled okra held a special place, even though it has slowly faded from everyday tables in much of the country. Fresh okra pods were washed and trimmed, then packed tightly into glass jars with garlic cloves, dill, and sometimes hot peppers. A boiling vinegar brine was poured over them, sealing in a sharp, tangy flavor that would develop over weeks. The result was crisp, slightly slimy in texture, yet deeply seasoned with garlic and spice. During the early to mid-20th century, especially in rural southern households, pickled vegetables were essential. Refrigeration was not always reliable or widespread, and gardens often produced more food than could be eaten fresh. Pickling ensured nothing went to waste, and okra, which grew easily in warm climates, became a common candidate for preservation. Pickled okra was served as a side dish with fried chicken, barbecue, or simple cornbread meals. It also appeared on holiday tables and at community gatherings, where jars of homemade pickles were exchanged as gifts between neighbors. Over time, however, changing food preferences and the rise of store-bought pickles pushed homemade versions into the background. Okra itself also became more regionally limited, and outside the South, many Americans never developed a taste for its unique texture. Today, pickled okra survives mostly in specialty markets and family recipes passed down through generations. Yet it remains a quiet reminder of a time when every garden harvest mattered, and preserving food was both a necessity and a skill, turning simple green pods into jars of sharp, lasting flavor that carried families through the seasons.